A glass display case sits under fluorescent lights, the kind you'd find in a small-town hobby shop, with old cartridges lined up like fossils. One of them still has a handwritten label, Eevee Save, Don't Reset. By now, everyone knows Eevee is famous because it can become many different Pokémon. The part that keeps pulling people back, though, is that the games don't treat those evolutions as equal doors in a hallway. They treat them like clues. So here's the central question. If Eevee is officially defined by adaptability, why do its evolution methods keep changing as the series changes? Consider the evidence before we go any further. In Generation 1, Eevee's entire future can be decided in seconds with a fire, water, or thunderstone. In Generation 2, it becomes a relationship test where time of day matters as much as friendship. And in Generation 4, the game literally asks you to stand in the right place on the map, near a specific rock, before the transformation is even possible. We'll start with the simple, original idea of Eevee as a branching experiment in early Pokémon design, then move through every evolution method and what it implies inside the world, and finally zoom out into what the Pokédex repeatedly says about Eevee's biology across generations. And once you notice the pattern, Eevee stops being a cute mascot with many forms and starts feeling like the series' quietest long-running mystery, one that keeps rewriting its own rules while pretending it never changed. There are Pokémon you meet on the road, and then there are Pokémon the game makes you receive. Eevee belongs to the second category, and that small difference changes the feeling of it. In the original Kanto games, Eevee doesn't step out of tall grass with the same casual randomness as a Pidgey. Celadon is bright on the surface, all department store windows and pedestrian paths. It's handed to you inside Celadon City, tucked into the upper floors of a place that already feels like a museum, half mansion and half memory. Then you push open the mansion doors and hear the interior music, softer, older, like the game is narrowing its voice. I still remember the first time I got that gift. Not because Eevee was the strongest thing in my team, because it usually wasn't. Upstairs, among quiet rooms and NPCs who talk like they've been here for years, you're given a Pokémon whose entire identity is possibility. It was because the game made me pause, like it had placed a decision on the table and walked away to see what I'd do. Eevee's Pokédex category, the label printed right on its identity, is the Evolution Pokémon. That isn't a poetic nickname from a fan site or a vibe from the anime. In Generation 1, that identity is built from a very simple mechanical truth. Eevee can branch into 3 different final forms using 3 different elemental stones. It's a formal classification sitting beside height and weight, as if evolution is not something Eevee does, but something Eevee is. The franchise didn't invent item-based evolution for Eevee, but Eevee is where that concept becomes a character trait rather than a one-off rule. They're endings, and the game treats them like endings. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon are not just evolutions in the way a metapod is a stepping stone. Each one is a full stop that you choose, and the original design makes sure you feel the weight of the choice. Celadon City doesn't just give you Eevee, it gives you access to the means to change Eevee. Part of that weight comes from how the stones are positioned in Kanto. In the same city, the department store sells elemental stones, turning evolution into something you can purchase with money you earned through battles and exploration. The mansion says, "Here is a rare gift," and the department store says, "Here are 3 keys." That pairing is deliberate in the way good game design often is. Quiet, not announced, but impossible to miss once you notice it. Then, the game steps back and lets the player define what Eevee will mean on their team. Water is endurance and adaptability. Electricity is speed and pressure. Fire is brute force and heat. Even the 3 options feel like archetypes, cleanly separated. The first time you face that menu, you're not only picking a Pokémon, you're picking a style. Eevee is capable, but it doesn't dominate the early game on raw numbers alone. That's why Eevee's base form is built to be modest rather than overpowering. Vaporeon leans into aquatic traits so thoroughly, it looks like it belongs in a different ecosystem than Eevee ever did. It feels like a sketch before the ink, a template waiting for a decision. The evolutions, by contrast, are designed as specializations with sharper silhouettes, sharper roles, and sharper identities. Jolteon turns fur into something like a weapon, all spikes and tension, like the body itself is charged. Flareon completes the trio by doing the opposite of subtle. Its look is warm and heavy, built around a mane that reads like stored heat. Even without checking a move list, you can tell what kind of battles the designers want you to imagine. Jolteon is the kind of Pokémon that acts first and forces the opponent to respond. The games reinforce that idea through how each form feels in battle. There are Pokémon you meet on the road, and then there are Pokémon the game makes you receive. Eevee belongs to the second category, and that small difference changes the feeling of it. In the original Kanto games, Eevee doesn't step out of tall grass with the same casual randomness as a Pidgey. It's handed to you inside Celadon City, tucked into the upper floors of a place that already feels like a museum, half mansion and half memory. Celadon is bright on the surface, all department store windows and pedestrian paths. Then you push open the mansion doors and hear the interior music, softer, older, like the game is narrowing its voice. Upstairs, among quiet rooms and NPCs who talk like they've been here for years, you're given a Pokémon whose entire identity is possibility. I still remember the first time I got that gift. Not because Eevee was the strongest thing in my team, because it usually wasn't. It was because the game made me pause, like it had placed a decision on the table and walked away to see what I'd do. Eevee's Pokédex category, the label printed right on its identity, is the Evolution Pokémon. That isn't a poetic nickname from a fan site or a vibe from the anime. It's a formal classification sitting beside height and weight, as if evolution is not something Eevee does, but something Eevee is. In Generation 1, that identity is built from a very simple mechanical truth. Eevee can branch into 3 different final forms using 3 different elemental stones. The franchise didn't invent item-based evolution for Eevee, but Eevee is where that concept becomes a character trait rather than a one-off rule. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon are not just evolutions in the way a metapod is a stepping stone. They're endings, and the game treats them like endings. Each one is a full stop that you choose, and the original design makes sure you feel the weight of the choice. Part of that weight comes from how the stones are positioned in Kanto. Celadon City doesn't just give you Eevee, it gives you access to the means to change Eevee. In the same city, the department store sells elemental stones, turning evolution into something you can purchase with money you earned through battles and exploration. That pairing is deliberate in the way good game design often is. Quiet, not announced, but impossible to miss once you notice it. The mansion says, "Here is a rare gift," and the department store says, "Here are 3 keys." Then, the game steps back and lets the player define what Eevee will mean on their team. Even the 3 options feel like archetypes, cleanly separated. Water is endurance and adaptability. Electricity is speed and pressure. Fire is brute force and heat. The first time you face that menu, you're not only picking a Pokémon, you're picking a style. That's why Eevee's base form is built to be modest rather than overpowering. Eevee is capable, but it doesn't dominate the early game on raw numbers alone. It feels like a sketch before the ink, a template waiting for a decision. The evolutions, by contrast, are designed as specializations with sharper silhouettes, sharper roles, and sharper identities. Vaporeon leans into aquatic traits so thoroughly, it looks like it belongs in a different ecosystem than Eevee ever did. Jolteon turns fur into something like a weapon, all spikes and tension, like the body itself is charged. Flareon completes the trio by doing the opposite of subtle. Its look is warm and heavy, built around a mane that reads like stored heat. Even without checking a move list, you can tell what kind of battles the designers want you to imagine. The games reinforce that idea through how each form feels in battle. Jolteon is the kind of Pokémon that acts first and forces the opponent to respond. Vaporeon is the kind of Pokémon that stays, soaks damage, and makes battles last longer than they should. Flareon's identity is the simplest to grasp and the hardest to master in early Kanto. It hits hard and looks like it should burn everything down. But fire as a type in the original Kanto environment has a particular set of matchups, and that reality gives Flareon a more specific niche than its design alone suggests. This is one of the earliest examples of something Pokémon does constantly. It lets the fantasy promise one thing, then lets the system teach you the limits. Eevee promises infinite potential. then the type chart introduces constraints. The result isn't disappointment, it's texture. The feeling that this world has rules that don't bend just because the Pokémon is special. Eevee is special anyway, and the games mark that status in small, almost theatrical ways. It's not just rare, it's often treated as an encounter you can't undo without choosing to undo it. If you save before you evolve, you're acknowledging that the choice matters, and thousands of players learned that ritual instinctively. Eevee's position in the Kanto Pokédex also adds to its mythic aura. It arrives late enough that you've already learned what evolution looks like in its most straightforward form. Level up, change shape, gain power. Then Eevee arrives and politely refuses to follow that script. Branching evolution is the real invention here, the moment where evolution stops being a single road and becomes a fork. Mechanically, it's simple. Emotionally, it's one of the most powerful things the early games do, because it turns a system into a story about identity. In a typical evolution line, you don't ask what the Pokémon will become, only when. With Eevee, when is less important than which is tied directly to the player, not to experience points. That makes Eevee a mirror. Some players want the fast, electric answer, a Pokémon that feels like a switchblade. Some want the water answer, the one that endures, survives, outlasts. Some want fire because it looks like it should be dramatic, and because the idea of a burning fox is hard to resist. None of those choices are wrong, and the game never frames one as canonically superior. It frames them as reflections of preference, which is why Eevee is still a mascot for player expression decades later. The official branding of Eevee supports that identity without needing fan interpretation. Even the phrase Evolution Pokémon is unusually direct compared to many Pokédex categories. A lot of categories describe habitat, behavior, or mythic role. Eevee's category is the mechanism itself. That's not common. It's the franchise telling you, right away, that Eevee's defining feature is not a weapon, not a song, not a haunt, but a capacity to change. Eevee's Japanese name, Eevee's Ure, is part of that same straightforwardness. It's a name that sits close to the sound of evolution, carrying the concept in its bones. The English Eevee preserves the rhythm and the idea, soft consonants around a harder core of meaning. There's another small detail that deepens the origin story, the way Eevee is often obtained as a single specimen. You're not usually wading into a swarm of Eevee and picking the best one. You're receiving a particular Eevee, as if it already has a history before it reaches you. That gift framing changes how you treat it. A common wild Pokémon can be replaced without guilt. A gifted Pokémon feels like a responsibility. It also changes how you remember it. Many players can describe the room where they received Eevee more clearly than they can describe where they caught their first Rattata. The environment becomes part of the Pokémon's identity, even though the Pokédex never mentions Celadon City. That's one reason Eevee is so effective as a long-term franchise symbol. It lives at the intersection of mechanics and emotion, and it teaches the player that these games are not only about battles, they're about decisions that feel personal. Even when the game is made of pixels and menus, Eevee also arrives at a time in the early games when you're learning how power is distributed. You've already seen that a Pokémon's final form often matters more than its early form. Then Eevee arrives and says, quietly, final form is a choice, not a destiny. That idea seems normal now because the franchise built on it, but in the context of early RPG design, it's striking. Many RPGs let you customize a character. Pokémon let you customize a creature, and Eevee is the cleanest early example. What makes it even more interesting is that Eevee's branching identity isn't limited to the trio in Generation 1 as a closed set. Even in the original framing, Eevee feels like a question the series hasn't fully answered yet. You can sense it in the way the Pokédex language leans into possibility rather than completion. The early games don't need to promise future evolutions for Eevee to feel like it could have them. That's the magic of designing a concept that implies expansion. A Pokémon defined by evolution naturally invites the thought, if it can change into 3 things, why not more? Over time, the series answers that thought with more branches, but the foundation is already here. Eevee is introduced as a branching experiment, and the experiment is stable enough to survive every mechanical overhaul that comes later. Even when evolution methods change across generations, the original core remains. Eevee is the Pokémon that makes evolution feel like identity. There's also a subtle storytelling lesson in how the original trio are chosen. Water, electric, fire are not random types. They are types with clear, intuitive associations for anyone who has ever played a game, watched a cartoon, or read a fantasy story. Water becomes fluidity and resilience. Electric becomes speed and nervous energy. Fire becomes intensity and heat. The trio also map neatly onto the way early Pokémon battles feel. In Kanto, you are constantly meeting water types, constantly dealing with normal types, constantly learning that speed matters. Choosing an Eeveelution is a way of choosing what problems you want to solve more easily. And the game gives you that choice at a moment when your team's identity is still forming. Most players have a starter, a few catches, maybe a flyer, maybe a water option. Eevee arrives like a quiet invitation to shape the team's future, rather than just react to whatever appeared on Route 3. I've always found it telling that Eevee's gift is placed in a city, not in a forest. It's not a nature moment, it's a society moment. You get Eevee in the middle of commerce and comfort, near a department store that literally sells evolution. That detail doesn't need to be explained in dialogue to be felt. It suggests that Eevee is rare enough to be owned and gifted, valuable enough to be kept indoors, and famous enough that the player is expected to recognize its importance. The game trusts you to understand that this isn't just another acquisition. Even the pacing around Eevee supports that. You can ignore it for a while, keep it as Eevee, and the game doesn't punish you for that choice. Eevee's existence creates a lingering question in your party screen, a slot that can become 3 different answers whenever you decide. That lingering question becomes part of the player's relationship with the Pokémon. Some people evolve it immediately because decisions feel satisfying. Some people keep it unevolved because the potential feels more valuable than any single outcome. Both behaviors are responses the game makes room for. That's the mark of a concept designed with care. It produces different player stories without needing different cutscenes. Eevee's origin is not just a species debut, it's a debut of a design philosophy. The franchise later turns Eevee into a symbol in marketing and media, but the groundwork is already present in Kanto's quiet architecture. A gift Pokémon in a mansion, 3 stones in a department store, a Pokédex category that refuses to talk about claws or flames or intelligence, and instead talks about transformation as if it were anatomy. From the first moment, Eevee is a Pokémon built to make you think about the rules behind the world, not just the creatures inside it. And once you notice that, the early games feel less like a simple adventure, and more like a series of carefully placed experiments, with Eevee as one of the clearest. This is part of why Eevee is such a durable concept. Its core fantasy doesn't depend on a single era's mechanics. It survives because potential is a theme that works whether you're a kid choosing your first favorite, or an experienced player optimizing matchups. Even the original 3 evolutions are designed to remain useful beyond Kanto's storyline. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon don't evolve further, and they don't need to. They're presented as complete answers, not intermediate stages. That complete answer feeling is reinforced in smaller ways, like learn sets, and how the evolved forms occupy the party screen. Once evolved, Eevee's slot feels final, less like a project, and more like a settled identity. The series rarely makes you feel that finality so cleanly, because most lines are linear and expected. Eevee also becomes a template for how later generations introduce new evolutions tied to new mechanics. But you can already see the seeds in Generation 1. The concept is modular, a base form with neutral potential, plus a trigger that commits it to a new type, plus a role that changes how it fights. That modularity is one reason Eevee's family can expand without breaking the idea. Adding a new Eeveelution isn't like adding a random cousin. It's like adding a new answer to a question the series has been asking since Kanto. The question is always some variation of, what does adaptation look like in this era of Pokémon? Back in the beginning, adaptation is expressed through stones, which are tangible and easy to understand. Stones are physical objects you can hold, buy, and use at will. That makes the act of evolution feel like a conscious choice, almost like using a key in a lock. It also creates an interesting tension in world. If evolution can be purchased in a department store, then evolution is not purely natural in this setting. It's a technology, or at least a commodified phenomenon, which is a quietly radical piece of world-building for a game that otherwise keeps its science off-stage. The early games don't explain stones in scientific detail, and they don't need to. They show you a world where a glowing mineral can rewrite a creature's body. Eevee is the cleanest demonstration because the same creature reacts in 3 different ways to 3 different stones. That makes Eevee one of the first Pokémon that encourages players to think about evolution as something more complex than leveling up. Leveling up is about time and experience, something earned. Stone evolution is about intervention, something applied. Eevee sits right at the intersection of those 2 ideas, because its later branches in future generations incorporate both. But even in Generation 1, that intersection is already present in the player's behavior. You train Eevee, you bond with Eevee in your own way, and then you intervene to decide its identity. One of the most enduring details about Eevee's early design is how it invites both casual affection and obsessive planning. A casual player can choose the coolest-looking evolution and feel satisfied. A more analytical player can compare types, stats, and team needs and feel satisfied. Eevee welcomes both approaches because its concept is readable at a glance. You don't need to know a spreadsheet to understand that Eevee can change. And once you do know spreadsheets, Eevee becomes even more fascinating because each branch plays differently. That dual appeal is rare. Many Pokémon are either cute first or competitive first, depending on how they're designed and distributed. Eevee is a bridge between those worlds, and that bridge is part of its origin story. Even the name Eeveelution, while not an in-game label, reflects how naturally the fandom latched on to the idea of Eevee as a family, rather than a single species. The official games and media reinforce that family identity by consistently presenting Eevee with its evolutions as a set. You see it in art, in in-game NPC teams, and in how the franchise groups them as a recognizable collection. What's striking is how quickly that grouping becomes instinctive for players. Most evolution lines are remembered as, "This becomes that." Eevee is remembered as "This becomes one of many," and that memory style is different. It changes how you tell stories about the game. Instead of saying, "I evolved my Eevee," you say, "I chose Jolteon," or "I went with Vaporeon." The language of the player naturally shifts from process to decision. That language shift is a clue to why Eevee has such a strong emotional footprint. A decision feels like a reflection of the self. A process feels like something that happens whether you care or not. Eevee's origin in Kanto is the franchise learning how to make a mechanic feel like identity, not through cutscenes or speeches, but through placement, scarcity, and a simple fork in the road. And because it's done so quietly, it stays powerful even when you replay the game as an adult who already knows what happens. There's also a craftsmanship detail in how the original trio cover different sensory fantasies. Vaporeon is smooth and fluid, an aquatic silhouette that suggests motion. Jolteon is sharp and tense, a silhouette that suggests suddenness. Flareon is warm and dense, a silhouette that suggests heat you can almost feel. These aren't abstract design ideas. They're emotional textures expressed through pixel art and later through more detailed models. Eevee's branching identity works because the outcomes are distinct, not only in type, but in mood. That mood distinction becomes important as Eevee's family grows later, because the series keeps using Eevee to embody contrast. But the earliest contrast is already here. 3 elements, 3 temperaments, 3 visual languages. It's a complete mini-lesson in how Pokémon communicates identity through form. If you take anything useful from Eevee's origin, it's this. The franchise's most memorable ideas often arrive as simple mechanics placed in meaningful contexts. Eevee's gift location, the nearby stones, the modest base form, and the finality of the choice combine into something bigger than the sum of parts. It's an early example of Pokémon making the player feel like their preferences matter inside the world. And once you've noticed how carefully that first Eevee is staged, you start noticing similar staging elsewhere in the series. You recognize when a game is handing you a choice rather than a creature. You recognize when the world is nudging you towards self-definition. Eevee begins as a small gift in a quiet building, but it functions like a thesis for the whole franchise. You don't just catch Pokémon, you build a team that says something about how you see the world's rules. That's why the Evolution Pokémon label still feels accurate decades later, because it's less a category and more a promise that this one species will keep reflecting the series back at you. Eevee's evolution methods aren't just how to get the form you want. They're the series quietly teaching you what kind of world Pokémon thinks it is in that generation. In some eras, evolution is a commodity you can buy. In others, it's treated like a relationship outcome, something you earn through time, routine, and restraint. Eevee is the one species that has been asked to wear every version of that philosophy without losing its identity. The Kanto method, 3 stones, 1 irreversible decision. In Generation 1, Eevee's branching is blunt and physical. Use a Water Stone, and you get Vaporeon. Use a Thunderstone, and you get Jolteon. And a Fire Stone turns it into Flareon. That sounds simple until you remember how stones functioned in those early games. A stone doesn't feel like leveling up. It feels like intervention. It's you stepping into the biology of the world and forcing a change with an object. The games reinforce that feeling by making the stones tangible purchases. You can walk into Celadon department store, go to the right floor, and buy the transformation like you're buying supplies. Eevee is the moment a lot of players first realize evolution can be something you do to a Pokémon, not just something that happens. I used to hover over that use item prompt longer than I'd ever admit out loud. Not because I didn't know what the evolutions were, but because the button press felt final. The game doesn't dress it up with fanfare, which somehow makes it heavier. There's also an older mechanical pressure hiding underneath that choice. Stone evolutions, especially in the earlier generations, are famous for having different level-up learning patterns than their unevolved forms. A lot of players learned, through trial and mild regret, that evolving too early could mean missing certain moves you wanted first. So even in the simple era, there's a quiet ritual many people fell into. Train Eevee a little longer than you need to. Wait until it learns something useful, then commit. That ritual is part of why the Kanto method sticks in memory. It's not only a type choice, it's a timing choice. The player ends up shaping Eevee through patience before the stone ever touches it. When later remakes revisit Kanto, that stone identity remains the anchor. The tools are still stones, the outcomes are still the same trio, and the choice still reads as a clean fork. Even as evolution systems get more complex elsewhere, Kanto Eevee keeps that original clarity. One item, one outcome. The rules don't bend for Eevee. The game simply closes certain doors unless you trade. A famous case is the Kanto remakes on Game Boy Advance, where the lack of a built-in real-time clock means time-based evolution can't function normally. So even though Espeon and Umbreon exist in the broader generation ecosystem, evolving Eevee into them isn't something those games handle by themselves. If you want the Johto pair in that environment, you're pushed toward trading with games that do track time. That detail matters because it shows the franchise treating evolution requirements as real mechanics, not optional flavor. The game doesn't say, sure, day-night evolutions happen anyway. It says, in effect, no clock, no time-based biology. Even when you don't know the behind-the-scenes reasons, you can feel the philosophy. Eevee's evolutions aren't just rewards, they're proofs that the world's systems are operating. If the system isn't present, the evolution isn't either. This is where Eevee starts to feel like a test of a player's patience in a different way. With stones, impatience is fine. You can buy certainty. With friendship and time, impatience is punished by mistiming or by treating Eevee like a disposable battler. And the series never really lets you forget that lesson after Johto introduces it. Even in later generations that add more evolution methods, Espeon and Umbreon remain the reminder that how you raised it can be as important as what you used on it. The deeper pattern. Eevee's methods are teaching tools. By the end of the early generations, Eevee already has 2 major evolution philosophies attached to it. One is transactional, stones. The other is relational, friendship plus time. Those 2 philosophies create different kinds of player stories. A stone evolution story is often about planning, type coverage, and commitment. A friendship evolution story is often about routine, restraint, and a weird sense of companionship that comes from protecting one specific creature from fainting. I've noticed that people talk about these 2 categories differently, even years later. Nobody says they bonded with a water stone. But plenty of people describe raising an Eevee into Umbreon like it was a project they shared with the game's clock. That's the part I keep coming back to as a researcher of this series. Eevee's evolution methods aren't random hurdles. They're the franchise's way of turning invisible systems, items, time, affection into something you can feel in your hands. And that's only the beginning of Eevee's method history. Once the series starts tying Eevee to specific places in the world, and later to moves and newer bonding mechanics, the evolution menu becomes less like a fork in the road and more like a map of the franchise's changing ideas about what adaptation means. The moment Generation 4 arrives, Eevee's evolution stops being something you carry in your bag. It becomes something the map itself is doing to you. You can feel that shift most clearly in Sinnoh, because Sinnoh is obsessed with place. Forests have names that sound like old stories, roots are swallowed by weather, and the world is built to make you notice where you are standing. That's exactly where Leafeon and Glaceon come in. In Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, Eevee can evolve into Leafeon by leveling up near a moss rock, and into Glaceon by leveling up near an ice rock. You're no longer using evolution, you're stepping into it. The moss rock sits in Eterna Forest, and Eterna Forest has a specific kind of quiet, tall trees, filtered light, and that sense that the air is heavier than it should be. If you've ever walked through it with an Eevee in your party, you know the strange tension. One level up can rewrite your plan. Route 2117 does the same thing in the opposite mood. Wind, snow, limited visibility, and a path that feels like it's testing your patience. The ice rock is there, and it turns the blizzard into a mechanism. What I love about these two rocks is how blunt the games are about it once you trigger it. No speech, no ceremony, no NPC explaining the science. Eevee simply reacts, as if the world has been giving off the right signal the whole time. There's also a practical lesson hiding inside this design, and Sinnoh teaches it the hard way. When Eevee levels up near those rocks, the rock evolution takes priority over the time of day friendship evolutions. So the same Eevee that would have become Espeon in daylight or Umbreon at night can still become Leafeon or Glaceon if you level it up in the wrong place. That priority rule creates the most "I didn't mean to do that" Eevee stories in the entire franchise. I've seen players raise a careful, high-friendship Eevee for Umbreon, wander into Eterna Forest for something unrelated, use a rare candy out of habit, and suddenly watch it turn into Leafeon instead. It's not unfair because the game is consistent, but it's unforgettable. Generation 5 carries that location idea into Unova, and the mood changes again. Unova's Moss Rock is in Pinwheel Forest, and the Ice Rock is in Twist Mountain. One is green, layered, and maze-like. The other is industrial, cold, and full of tunnels. Twist Mountain in particular has a very deep mine feeling, the kind of place where light fades and the walls start to look the same. The Ice Rock is down in the basement level, and the game is strict about it. Eevee has to level up in the room with the rock to become Glaceon. It's one of those mechanics that makes the world feel less like a set and more like a machine. Unova also reinforces the idea that these rocks are not decorative. They're evolutionary infrastructure, almost like natural reactors. And because Unova is a region that leans into seasons, cities, and shifting environments, it fits that Eevee's biology is being written as responsive rather than destined. Then Kalos takes the same concept and makes it feel like a fairy tale. Route 20, Winding Woods, contains a moss rock, and it's placed in a way that's almost too perfect. Early enough that you notice it, quiet enough that it feels secret. You're walking through trees that seem designed to confuse you, and then there's this calm patch of grass around a rock that changes a Pokemon's future. Colossa's Ice Rock sits deep inside Frost Cavern, and you need Surf to reach it. That detail matters because it turns Glaceon into something you unlock, not something you do the moment you catch Eevee. It's the game tying a form to progression in a physical way, as if the region itself is withholding that temperature until you earn access. Around this point in the series, Eevee's evolution methods start to look less like a list and more like a set of categories. Stones are the item category, but Espeon and Umbreon are the bond plus time category. Leafeon and Glaceon become the environment category, where geography matters as much as training. And once you see Eevee through that lens, the different games start to feel like different scientific papers written in the same universe, each one testing a new variable. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are a great example of the franchise revisiting older regions while keeping the newer evolution logic alive. Hoenn originally didn't have a Moss Rock or Ice Rock in its classic era, because Leafeon and Glaceon didn't exist yet. So the remakes add them in a way that feels like a natural retrofit. The Moss Rock appears in Petalburg Woods, tucked into the forest and gated behind Cut. That's not just an obstacle, it's a statement that place evolution is something you discover by learning how to move through the region. It makes Leafeon feel like a reward for navigation, not just knowledge. The Ice Rock appears in Shoal Cave, and Shoal Cave is famous for its tide mechanic. Certain areas are reachable only at low tide, and in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the tides change on a schedule. So if you want Glaceon there, you're not only going to a location, you're coordinating with the region's living rhythm. There's a particular kind of player memory that comes from that. Not I used an ice stone, but I waited for low tide and went down to the ice room. That story feels like you did something real in the world, even though it's all systems. Alola continues the geography theme, but makes it feel organic and tropical. A Moss Rock is located in lush jungle, tied neatly to a place that already feels humid and alive. An Ice Rock is inside Mount Lanakeela's cave, where the region's cold identity finally becomes physical. And again, the priority rules matter. If your Eevee is high friendship, and you meant for Espeon, the jungle can still claim it as Leafeon the moment it levels. That isn't just a trick, it's the franchise being consistent about a quiet hierarchy. Environment signals override routine signals. By Generation 6, Eevee gets another branch that's both method and message. Sylveon arrives with the fairy type, and its evolution requirement is deliberately intimate. Eevee needs to know a fairy-type move, and in Generations 6 and 7, it needs at least 2 levels of affection. Affection is raised through the interaction systems of those games, like Pokémon Amy and Kalos and its later equivalents. This is where Eevee's evolution starts to feel like the games are reading the player's hands. Not just did you battle, but did you engage with the bonding features the generation is proud of. Sylveon is the franchise rewarding the kind of player behavior it built new UI for. There's a sharp mechanical edge to Sylveon's method too. If Eevee meets the conditions for Espeon or Umbreon, and also meets the conditions for Sylveon, Sylveon wins. The game essentially says, if you taught the fairy move and built the bond, that bond is the loudest signal. And yet, even Sylveon has a limit. If you level Eevee near a Moss Rock or Ice Rock in games where those exist, Leafeon or Glaceon can still override Sylveon. That little rule is one of the cleanest biology feels consistent moments in the series, because it treats environmental radiation like the strongest force in the room. Then Generation 8 changes the shape of the whole conversation, especially for Leafeon and Glaceon. From Generation 8 onward, Leafeon can evolve using a Leaf Stone, and Glaceon can evolve using an Ice Stone. That's a huge philosophical move. Geography stops being mandatory, and item certainty returns. In Sword and Shield, the Moss Rock and Ice Rock aren't present, so the place evolution method is effectively retired in that region's main experience. Instead, the game simplifies access and makes the evolutions portable again. It's the series choosing convenience and consistency across a massive open wild area style design. Sylveon changes in a similar way across that generational boundary. From Generation 8 onward, its requirement is framed in terms of high friendship plus a fairy-type move, rather than the older affection system. It's the franchise compressing multiple bond meters back into a single readable idea. Raise it well, teach it the right kind of move, level it up. Scarlet and Violet continue that modern pattern. Leafeon and Glaceon are still tied to Leaf Stone and Ice Stone rather than map rocks, and the older rock objects simply aren't part of that region's baseline design. So Eevee's branching remains wide, but the triggers are more standardized. And then there are the special exceptions that prove the rule. The games sometimes create an Eevee that is literally not allowed to evolve. In Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, the partner Eevee is a unique case. It cannot evolve. You can still obtain regular Eevee in those games, but the partner is locked into being itself, like the game is forcing a bond narrative through mechanics. Sword and Shield has another official constraint. An Eevee with the Gigantamax factor is unable to evolve. That's not a fan theory or a rumor. It's a designed trade-off. If the Eevee is built to transform into a giant form, it sacrifices the classic transformation into a different species. When you lay all of this out, Eevee's evolution history starts to look less like 8 forms and more like a record of what each generation valued. Generation 1 valued items and clear choices. Generation 2 valued time systems and the idea that raising a Pokémon is more than battling. Generation 4 and 5 valued place maps with meaning, environments with mechanical identity. Generation 6 and 7 valued direct interaction systems, asking players to nurture through features that weren't strictly about combat. Generation 8 and 9 lean back toward portability and consistency, smoothing the edges so the player isn't trapped by geography. The useful takeaway, if you're the kind of person who likes to understand why these games feel the way they do, is that Eevee is basically Pokémon's living design diary. If you want to know what a generation is trying to teach you, how it wants you to behave, what it wants you to notice, watch what it asks of Eevee. Eevee doesn't just evolve, it translates the era into biology. If you want the most official explanation for why Eevee can become so many different forms, the games don't hide it in a side quest. They print it in the Pokédex again and again, across decades, with a tone that's almost clinical. Eevee's entries return to one core claim. Its body is unusually unstable in a way that makes evolutionary change easy to trigger. Not mystical, not chosen, not destined. Unstable, adaptable, and responsive. In the earliest generations, the language is blunt about genetics. Eevee is described as having an irregular or unusual genetic structure, and that structure is presented as the reason it reacts so dramatically to certain stimuli. That word choice matters, because Pokémon could have framed Eevee as magical, but instead it keeps reaching for pseudo-biology. The Pokédex often treats evolution like something close to mutation. It's not presented as a slow, natural process over lifetimes. It's presented as a rapid rewrite that can be induced by the right kind of energy, environment, or bond. And Eevee is the species the Pokédex uses to make that logic feel coherent. If a water stone can change one creature into an aquatic specialist, the series needs a creature whose biology is already ready to change. So the entries keep telling you Eevee is built like a living hinge. There's a specific pattern to how these entries are written. They usually start with a simple, high-level fact. Eevee can evolve in many ways, then justify it with a biological explanation. Then they add an environmental angle, the idea that surroundings and conditions don't just influence Eevee emotionally, but physically. That environmental framing shows up across generations as a repeated theme, not a one-off line. Eevee is described as being able to adjust its body to suit different habitats. That's the series translating a game mechanic into an in-world survival trait. When the Pokédex mentions stones, it often implies the stones are emitting something like radiation or energy that triggers a change. That's a remarkable choice of word for a franchise known for myth and folklore. It grounds evolution in a kind of science fiction biology. Exposure causes a sudden shift. That claim also quietly reframes what evolution stones are in this world. They're not just rare rocks that happen to work. They're objects with a measurable effect on living tissue, powerful enough that a single exposure can lock Eevee into a specialized form. If you've ever wondered why the game treats stone evolution as a one-way door, the Pokédex logic supports it. Eevee isn't trying out a type like clothing. Its body is being rewritten at the cellular level, quickly, decisively, and permanently. Across later generations, the Pokédex keeps expanding on the same idea without changing it. Eevee's genetic composition is described as highly unstable. That instability is framed as the cause of its unusually varied evolutionary outcomes. The entries also repeatedly emphasize that this isn't common among Pokémon. Eevee is described as rare, and its evolutionary possibilities are described as exceptional. Even in a world full of transformations, Eevee is singled out as a special case. I always found that interesting, because it means the franchise is aware of how unusual Eevee is even inside its own rules. A lot of species evolve once or twice, but those evolutions are fixed and predictable. Eevee is predictable only in the sense that it will respond strongly to the right trigger, not in what it will become. The Pokédex uses a second repeated theme to explain this: adaptation. Eevee is described as having an ability to adjust to environments, almost like a biological blank slate. This is where the Evolution Pokémon label stops being cute branding and starts reading like a scientific classification. In real-world biology terms, the Pokédex is basically saying, this is a species with unusually flexible developmental pathways. In Pokémon terms, it's saying, Eevee is built to take hints from its surroundings. The environment isn't just scenery, it's part of the evolutionary system. That's why later, when Leafeon and Glaceon are introduced, the concept feels consistent even before you know the mechanics. If Eevee is truly environment responsive, then a forest's energy or a mountain's cold could plausibly matter. The Pokédex has already trained you to accept that logic. You can even see the franchise balancing two explanations at once. One explanation is chemical or energetic. Stones, special locations, conditions that function like physical signals. The other explanation is behavioral. Bonds, friendship, the idea that consistent care influences the outcome. The Pokédex doesn't always spell out the bond mechanic in raw game terms, but the broader canon supports it through how evolution is tied to raising a Pokémon well. Eevee becomes the species where emotion and biology are allowed to touch, because the series treats the trainer-Pokémon relationship as a real force in the world. Not metaphorically real, but mechanically real. That creates a very specific kind of lore feeling. In Pokémon, affection is not only story flavor, it's a condition with biological consequences. And Eevee is written as the species most capable of turning that condition into a new body. There's also something the Pokédex does that's easy to miss unless you read a lot of entries back to back. It repeats itself on purpose, but it repeats with slight shifts in emphasis depending on the era. The core stays stable, but the angle changes. In the earliest entries, the focus tends to be on irregular genetics and sudden mutation. In later entries, the focus leans more into environmental adaptability and varied evolutionary potential. It's the same claim told in different vocabulary, shaped by the generation's identity. That's one reason Eevee's Pokédex writing feels unusually consistent over time. Many species get wildly different flavor across generations depending on who wrote the entry and what tone that era had. These entries, in contrast, keep orbiting the same science-like explanation because the mechanic demands it. I'll be honest about the way this lands when you read it as an adult. The Pokédex is essentially turning Eevee into the franchise's favorite model organism. It's the Pokémon world's lab mouse, not in the sense of being mistreated, but in the sense of being biologically informative. Eevee is the species you point to when you want to argue that Pokémon evolution is not just growing up. It's transformation under stimulus, and stimulus can be physical, geographic, and social. That's an enormous claim for a series that often pretends not to have hard science, and it quietly reshapes how you interpret other evolutions too. If stones emit energy that rewrites cells, then what does it mean when a trade triggers evolution? If friendship can trigger a bodily rewrite, what does that suggest about how deeply the Pokémon world believes relationships can reach? Eevee doesn't answer those questions directly, but it gives you the framework to ask them without leaving canon. It's the first species where the Pokédex insists you think about mechanisms, not just outcomes. Another repeated theme is many possible evolutions. Some entries explicitly note that Eevee has the potential to evolve into different forms depending on conditions. It's one of the few Pokémon where the Pokédex openly treats evolution as branching rather than linear. That matters because the Pokédex is written as an encyclopedic object in-universe. So when it says many possible evolutions, it implies researchers inside the Pokémon world recognize Eevee as a special case. They're not surprised by it. They've categorized it, and the way the Pokédex talks about Eevee suggests those researchers don't fully romanticize it. They describe it with words that imply unpredictability and volatility. Eevee's gift is also its risk. A body that changes easily is a body that can be pushed around by forces outside its control. That's an interpretation, but it's an interpretation anchored in the tone of the entries. They rarely describe Eevee as stable. They describe it as responsive, easily influenced, and prone to shifting when exposed to certain conditions. This makes Eevee's entire family feel less like a collection of costumes and more like a collection of survival strategies. Vaporeon is not just water Eevee. It's Eevee's biology taking a hard turn toward an aquatic solution. Jolteon is a nervous system solution, speed and voltage shaped into a body. Flareon is a heat solution, a form built around generating and storing thermal energy. Even without quoting any single entry, you can feel that the Pokédex wants you to see these as real physiological specializations. When Espeon and Umbreon enter the picture, the Pokédex tone still supports the same underlying logic: different conditions, different bodies. Day and night become environmental variables. The bond becomes a behavioral variable with biological consequences. And then later, Leafeon and Glaceon turn place into a variable strong enough to override time. That's where Eevee's Pokédex identity and Eevee's gameplay identity fuse perfectly. The world itself becomes part of Eevee's biology. I've caught myself doing something slightly ridiculous when replaying these games. I'll arrive at a forest location tied to Leafeon, slow down, and think about what it means that a single patch of ground can alter a species. Not because I'm trying to roleplay, but because the series wrote the idea convincingly enough that it invites that kind of attention. That's the hidden benefit of reading Eevee's Pokédex trail as one continuous document across generations. It teaches you how Pokémon explains itself when it bothers to explain itself at all. Mechanics become biology, and biology becomes a way to make the world feel rule-bound. And once you learn that reading skill, you can apply it everywhere. You start seeing the franchise as a set of consistent claims, rather than disconnected gimmicks. Eevee is the cleanest textbook for that, because its claim has to stay consistent for its branching to feel fair. In a way, Eevee's Pokédex writing is the series admitting it wants both myth and mechanism. Legends exist, but so do measurable stimuli. Stories exist, but so do genetic structures described as irregular and adaptable. Eevee sits in the middle of that tension and makes it readable. It gives the Pokémon world a quiet scientific backbone, without ever turning the franchise into a hard sci-fi narrative. And the fact that the games keep repeating that explanation across eras tells you the designers know Eevee's magic works best when it's treated like biology. That illusion becomes stronger when evolution methods change across games, but the Pokédex premise stays steady. The rules for evolving Leafeon and Glaceon, for example, shift from specific rocks to stones in later generations. The Pokédex framing still holds because both methods can be understood as exposure to a particular kind of energy, just delivered in different packaging. That's the quiet strength of writing Eevee's biology as responsive to stimuli, rather than requires rock A. If the core is stimulus-response, the delivery method can change with game design needs without breaking the in-universe logic. The Pokédex doesn't need to rewrite its thesis every time the UI changes. There's also a subtle, almost moral tone in how Eevee's bond-based evolutions are presented through the broader canon. The games teach you that consistent care leads to certain outcomes. The Pokédex supports the idea that environment shapes biology, and the trainer is part of the environment. So the player learns a behavioral lesson without the game ever giving a sermon. If you keep a Pokémon safe, it grows differently. Eevee becomes the species where that lesson is most obvious. This is where Mervert sneaks in, because the Eevee story is quietly about attention. Not attention as hype, but attention as careful observation and consistent behavior. Eevee rewards the kind of player who notices conditions, respects systems, and accepts that choices have consequences. And even if you don't care about games as systems, that lesson lands on a human level. Small routines shape outcomes. Environment matters, sometimes more than raw effort. Another recurring detail in Eevee's broader canon is that its family tends to be used as a teaching set. The franchise uses Eevee to demonstrate type differences, evolution methods, and the idea of specialized roles. That teaching role doesn't require the Pokédex to say this is a tutorial Pokémon, but it's evident in how often Eevee is positioned as a choice. The Pokédex then acts like the textbook behind the lesson. It gives you the justification so the lesson doesn't feel like pure game logic. Eevee isn't only here to teach you, it's here to convince you that the world is coherent enough to be taught. If you want a concrete way to feel this coherence, try reading Eevee's entry, and then immediately reading entries for other branching or multi-method evolvers. Many of them are described through a single, specific trigger, like a particular item or trade condition. Eevee is described through a broader capacity, a trait that makes multiple triggers feel like valid expressions of the same biology. That distinction is why Eevee remains expandable. A species defined by a broad capacity can receive new outcomes without its core story breaking. A species defined by a single trigger can't easily be expanded without feeling like a retcon. Eevee's Pokédex framing essentially future-proofs it. But even before Sylveon exists, Eevee is described in a way that leaves room for more, because the text emphasizes variability rather than listing a closed set. The franchise didn't need to promise that expansion out loud for the design to support it. There's also a fascinating contrast between Eevee's Pokédex scientific tone and Eevee's cultural status inside the franchise. In media and merchandise, Eevee is often treated as a symbol of cuteness and approachability. In the Pokédex, Eevee is treated like a biological anomaly. Both can be true, and that tension is part of why Eevee feels richer than many mascots. It's adorable on the surface, and slightly unsettling if you think too hard about what it means for an organism to be so easily rewritten. The series never forces you to dwell on that, but it gives you the material if you choose to. I've had moments where I'm scrolling through entries in a newer game, and I feel that old Kanto choice again, the one that made me save before evolving. Not because the evolution itself is hard now, but because the idea behind Eevee still carries weight. The Pokédex keeps telling you, this creature is defined by thresholds, and thresholds are serious. If you step back, Eevee's Pokédex story is one of the franchise's most consistent internal explanations for why evolution can be so fast and so dramatic. It says, some Pokémon have bodies that change easily under the right conditions, and once that's on the table, a lot of other game logic stops feeling like pure abstraction. Trade evolution becomes less weird if you accept that stimulus can be social or energetic. Stone evolution becomes less magical if you accept that stones can emit something biologically active. Friendship evolution becomes less sentimental if you accept that routine and stress levels could plausibly affect a responsive organism in this world. That's the real utility of Eevee's Pokédex trail. It gives you a lens to interpret the franchise's strangest mechanics as part of a consistent internal worldview. Eevee is not only a collection of forms, it's the closest thing Pokémon has to an official argument about how transformation works. And once you start reading the series with that lens, you begin to notice a pattern that extends beyond Eevee. Pokémon often hides its most important world-building in plain text, repeated across decades, in the place most players skim. Eevee's entries are the training wheels for that style of reading. They teach you how to take the franchise at its word when it chooses to sound certain. Eevee's first 3 evolutions don't just add options. They establish a pattern the franchise keeps reusing. Take one flexible base, expose it to a strong signal, and get a body that looks like it was built for a specific kind of life. It's easy to call Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon the classic trio and stop there. But if you read them like a designer and like a Pokédex researcher, they're closer to 3 different philosophies of adaptation, and those philosophies become the blueprint for every later Eeveelution. Vaporeon, adaptation as habitat. Vaporeon is the most extreme you don't belong on land anymore outcome of the trio. Its design isn't just blue, it's aquatic in the way it commits to fins, a tail built for swimming, and a collar that reads like a frill shaped by water pressure. Even the face feels calmer, like the entire silhouette is meant to flow rather than spike or flare. In the battle system, Vaporeon's identity is anchored by endurance. It has the highest HP of the 3, and that single fact shapes how players experience it across generations. HP is not flashy, but it changes the rhythm of every fight it participates in. When I evolved my first Eevee into Vaporeon, it was because I wanted a water type that felt like it could stay on the field forever. It wasn't about winning fast, it was about not losing. And Vaporeon delivered that feeling immediately, even before I understood the numbers. The Pokédex often frames Vaporeon as a creature whose body is deeply compatible with water. It's written as if water isn't a terrain it visits, but an environment it can merge with. That framing is the clearest early example of the series treating evolution as a full-body ecological pivot. Vaporeon's lore also reinforces Eevee's responsive biology claim from the previous heading. Where Eevee's entries talk about unstable genetics, Vaporeon's entries tend to talk about the result, a body that can function in water so naturally it blurs the line between creature and environment. It's the franchise telling you, this is what specialization looks like when it goes all the way. Mechanically, water as a type has always been one of the most broadly supported in the main series. That matters for Vaporeon's template role, because it means the water branch of Eevee feels reliably usable in almost any game where you can get it. Vaporeon becomes the early proof that an evolution can be both flavorful and consistently practical. When abilities enter the series, Vaporeon's identity becomes even more coherent. Its classic ability, Water Absorb, turns water attacks into healing, which fits the idea of a creature that doesn't just endure water, but benefits from it. It's one of those cases where the mechanics read like an in-world trait rather than a rule bolted on later. And if you zoom out, Vaporeon teaches the series something important about Evolutions in general. An Eeveelution works best when its physiology, its battle role, and its flavor text all point in the same direction. Vaporeon's direction is survival through habitat alignment. Jolteon is the opposite of Vaporeon in silhouette language. Where Vaporeon flows, Jolteon bristles. It looks like a creature that has turned its own fur into a warning sign. That isn't just aesthetic. Jolteon's Pokédex framing emphasizes electricity as something stored and expressed through the body, often with attention on fur, charge, and discharge. The result is an evolution that reads like a living capacitor, built to hold tension and release it. In battle, Jolteon's template is speed. It has the highest speed of the trio, and that single stat defines how players remember it. It goes first. It pressures. It punishes hesitation. Speed changes the psychology of a fight, because it turns uncertainty into certainty. I have a very specific memory of being a kid and feeling like Jolteon was smart because it moved first. It wasn't actually intelligence. It was tempo. But Pokémon teaches you tempo through creatures like Jolteon, and once you learn it, you start seeing the whole combat system differently. Electric as a type also shapes Jolteon's identity across generations. It's a type associated with quick damage and clean answers to water and flying, so Jolteon often becomes the player's way of saying, "I don't want long fights, I want control." When abilities enter the picture, Jolteon's classic ability, Volt Absorb, mirrors Vaporeon's logic. Electricity doesn't just fail to hurt it, it restores it. That is a pure expression of the adaptation as specialization template. The element becomes nourishment, not threat. Jolteon also shows how the franchise uses Eeveelutions to teach contrasting body languages. Eevee's base form is soft and rounded, open to interpretation. Jolteon takes that softness and replaces it with angles, as if the environment carved it into a warning. That design choice becomes a recurring rule for later Eeveelutions too. Each evolution exaggerates a trait until it becomes readable at a glance, even in tiny sprites or small UI icons. Jolteon's exaggeration is, "Everything about me is charged." Flareon is the most emotionally immediate of the trio, because fire reads like drama. Its color palette is warm, its mane is thick, and its body language feels like a hearth that can become a blaze. It's the evolution that looks like it should turn the world orange the moment it appears. Pokédex writing tends to frame Flareon through heat production and storage. It's often described as a creature that generates intense warmth internally and releases it, as if it carries a furnace inside. That framing fits Eevee's stimulus to physiology story perfectly. The Firestone doesn't give it a trick, it rewrites its internal system. In battle, Flareon's template is raw physical strength among the trio. It has the highest attack of the three, which communicates a role even if you never read a guide. This one hits hardest. Attack is a promise, and Flareon's entire presence is built around that promise. Here's where the historical mechanics matter, because Flareon's story is also a story about how the battle system changed. For a long stretch of the main series, a move's physical or special category was determined by its type rather than by the move itself. Fire-type moves were special under that system, which created a famous mismatch. Flareon's best stat was physical attack, but its main fire attacks used the special category. That mismatch doesn't make Flareon bad as a creature, but it does shape how players experienced it. It encouraged Flareon to rely heavily on strong, normal-type physical moves for raw damage, while its fire typing functioned more like identity than like primary output. The creature looked like a firestorm and often played like a bruiser with a fiery signature. When the physical/special split arrives later, and moves are categorized individually, Flareon's template finally aligns more cleanly with its typing. Physical fire moves become meaningful tools for it, and its high attack feels like it belongs to the fire identity in a more direct way. Flareon becomes a living example of how a single systemic rule can reshape a Pokémon's practical role without changing the Pokémon itself. That's part of why these three evolutions function as templates. They are stable identities that pass through shifting systems, and the way they bend or resist those systems teaches you what the series values at that time. Vaporeon remains endurance, Jolteon remains speed, Flareon remains power, even when the details of how that power expresses itself change. When abilities enter the series, Flareon's classic ability, Flash Fire, completes the trio's elemental immunity pattern. Fire becomes not only harmless but beneficial, reinforcing the idea that each evolution is a commitment so deep it changes what counts as danger. It's a clean mechanical metaphor. Become the element, and the element stops harming you. If you line these three up, they look like three answers to the same question. What does it mean to adapt? Vaporeon answers, merge with an environment until it becomes home. Jolteon answers, turn the body into a conductor of speed and discharge. Flareon answers, store energy inside and express it as force. Those are not just type themes, they're survival strategies written as silhouettes. The trio also establishes something subtle about Eeveelutions that later Eeveelutions continue. An Eeveelution isn't just a type swap, it's a role swap. The typing, the stats, the lore, and the visual language all point toward the same role, and that role becomes the reason players remember the choice. The original trio also creates a lasting vocabulary of Eevee outcomes in the community. People don't simply say, "I evolved Eevee." They say, "I needed a bulky water," or "I wanted a fast electric," or "I wanted a fire that hits hard," and those statements are really about the trio's templates. There's another layer that matters if you care about how Pokémon teaches players without tutorials. Eevee hands you a single base form, then forces you to understand the difference between HP, speed, and attack through consequences. Vaporeon makes fights longer, Jolteon makes fights faster, Flareon makes hits heavier. That's a full lesson in combat identity, delivered through a single branching line. And because it comes from a gift Pokémon, many players absorb that lesson in a calm moment rather than in a crisis. It's one of the franchise's cleanest pieces of silent teaching. It also explains why later Eeveelutions often feel like deliberate expansions of this original trio. When the series adds Espeon and Umbreon, it adds a new template pair, offense specialization and defense specialization tied to time and bond. When it adds Leafeon and Glaceon, it adds new ecological templates tied to place. But it all starts here, with 3 stones and 3 roles. These 3 prove that Eevee can be a system for expressing player identity, not just a creature with a gimmick. And once that proof exists, the franchise can keep building on it without needing to reinvent the core promise. I still think the most revealing part is how different the feel is when you put each one in the lead slot. Vaporeon makes you willing to take hits because you trust it will stay standing. Jolteon makes you aggressive because you expect to move first. Flareon makes you decisive because you want the hit to matter. Those feelings are the real content of the trio, and they're why these evolutions remain memorable even for players who haven't touched Kanto in years. One of the most revealing hidden rules of the original trio is that they're built on the same skeleton. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon share the same overall base stat total. The designers didn't make one objectively more evolved than the others in raw sum. Possibly, they made 3 equal budgets, then spent those points in 3 different ways. That's why the choice feels clean. You're not choosing between strong and weak. You're choosing between where the strength lives. And because they share that budget, the differences become loud. Vaporeon pours an enormous amount into HP. Jolteon pours a huge amount into speed, and Flareon pours a huge amount into attack. Even if you never open a stat screen, the battle pacing teaches you the same truth. Vaporeon makes turns feel safe. Jolteon makes turns feel urgent. Flareon makes turns feel expensive, like every exchange should end with something falling. These are emotional lessons disguised as combat math. There's also a very specific Generation I quirk that makes the trio feel even more distinct when you revisit Kanto with adult eyes. In the earliest games, there isn't a separate special attack and special defense. There's one special stat that does both jobs. That single stat shapes the trio's identity in a way people often don't realize they remember. Water and electric are special types in that era's logic, so Vaporeon and Jolteon naturally align with a system that rewards special heavy play. Flareon, meanwhile, is holding a huge attack stat in a world where its type's main attacks are treated as special. That creates a strange little psychological split in the player's experience of Flareon. It looks like a physical bruiser. The game system, for a long time, asks it to express its fire identity through a category that doesn't match its most exaggerated stat. So Flareon becomes the first evolution that teaches an uncomfortable but useful lesson. Design fantasy and battle math can disagree, and Pokémon as a franchise has never stopped doing that. Some creatures look like tanks but don't take hits well. Some look gentle but hit like accidents. Flareon's mismatch in those early systems becomes a kind of historical fingerprint. It's one of the reasons longtime players talk about Flareon with a different tone than they talk about Vaporeon and Jolteon. There's affection in it, but also the sense that Flareon had to work harder to be itself. That story changes later, when the series divides the special and physical categories by move instead of by type. Once moves can be physical or special independent of type, Flareon's high attack starts to line up with its fire identity more naturally. The same Pokémon, same concept, but the system finally gives it the tools to speak in its own voice. Vaporeon and Jolteon also shift across these system changes, but in a smoother way. Vaporeon's HP identity survives every rule set because HP is always HP. Jolteon's speed identity survives every rule set because going first stays valuable in almost any battle format. That's why these two feel like the cleanest of the trio, as long-term templates. They're built on fundamentals. They demonstrate that if you make a Pokémon's identity revolve around something the series never stops respecting, it will age well. Once abilities are introduced, the trio's templates become even sharper, almost like the games are underlining the original design intent. Vaporeon's Water Absorb turns a water attack into healing. Jolteon's Volt Absorb does the same with electric. Flareon's Flash Fire completes the set by turning fire into a benefit rather than a threat. It's hard to overstate how elegant that is as a trio identity. The element is no longer just your theme, it becomes an energy you can literally feed on. Hidden abilities later add a second layer of identity, and the trio stays consistent there too. Vaporeon's Hydration aligns with water and weather logic. Jolteon's Quick Feet aligns with movement and tempo. Flareon's Guts aligns with the idea of pushing through pain and turning it into force. Even without reciting mechanics line by line, the pattern is clear. Each version of the system keeps trying to make the trio feel like real organisms with real adaptations. Another detail that makes the trio feel like templates is the way they carve up early Kanto's problems. Kanto is a region that quietly pressures you to build coverage, because so many routes and gyms punish single-type thinking. Eevee is handed to you at a moment when you're starting to notice that pressure. Vaporeon answers the region's abundance of fire and rock-adjacent challenges by giving you a water identity that endures. Jolteon answers the region's many water and flying encounters by giving you speed and electric pressure. Flareon answers the region's grass and bug-heavy stretches by giving you fire presence with strong physical weight behind it. This isn't the game telling you what to do. It's the game placing 3 keys on a table and letting you decide which lock matters most to you. And the decision can be emotional rather than logical without ever being wrong. I've watched people choose Jolteon because it looks like a lightning strike made into an animal, and then shape their whole team around that aesthetic. I've watched people choose Vaporeon because it feels serene, then discover they accidentally chose one of the most consistently useful defensive shapes in the line. I've watched people choose Flareon because it looks like warmth and power, then learn how to build around it with moves that match its strengths in that generation. Each one can become a personal story because each one demands a different style of attention. There's also a subtle difference in how these 3 teach you about risk. Jolteon teaches you that acting first is a form of safety because you can remove threats before they act. Vaporeon teaches you that absorbing hits is a form of safety because you can survive mistakes. Flareon teaches you a third kind of safety, remove the opponent's options by hitting hard enough that the fight never becomes complicated. Those are three different philosophies of control, and the trio lets you practice whichever one matches your temperament. If you zoom out to the broader canon, you can see why the franchise keeps returning to these three as a recognizable set. They're the oldest proof that Eevee's concept works. They show, immediately, that adaptability can become distinct bodies rather than a vague promise. And because they've been present since the beginning, they've accumulated a strange kind of cultural weight in the Pokémon world. In games, in anime appearances, in merchandise, these three often function like the classic starter alternatives for people who want an identity without picking a starter. They feel foundational, like the first three branches of a tree everyone recognizes. What makes them especially interesting is that they're not starter types, and yet they behave like a miniature starter trio in player memory. Water, electric, fire is not the standard grass-water-fire triangle, but the way players talk about them, endurance, speed, power, feels like the way players talk about starter choices. That's the genius of the original trio. It doesn't copy the starter dynamic, it creates a parallel one. It's a second choice axis offered later, when you already understand enough to make the choice meaningful. And because it arrives later, it often feels more yours than the starter you picked under pressure at the beginning. The trio also reveals something about how Pokémon balances cute and sharp. Eevee is designed to be broadly appealing, almost neutral. Each evolution takes that neutral appeal and commits it to a stronger visual language. Vaporeon shifts into sleek and aquatic. Jolteon shifts into spiky and volatile. Flareon shifts into plush and blazing, with a softness that still reads as stored power. That last point is important. Flareon's design is not only fire, it's fire contained. It doesn't look like a flame monster. It looks like a creature built to hold heat inside fur and body mass, until it decides to release it. That containment idea matches its lore tone, and it also matches how many players use it when it works best. Flareon is often treated like a decisive moment in a battle, not a constant pressure. It's the thing you bring out when you want the temperature to change. Jolteon, by contrast, is constant pressure by design. Its speed makes it feel like a lead, a pivot, a consistent threat. It's the evolution that teaches you how momentum wins fights before damage does. Vaporeon sits somewhere else entirely. It teaches you patience, and it teaches you that winning doesn't always look like big numbers. Sometimes it looks like refusing to go away, turn after turn, until the opponent runs out of meaningful actions. The trio also becomes a template for how the series can reward different player personalities without ever saying it out loud. Some players are planners, some are gamblers, some are stubborn, some are decisive. Eevee's first three outcomes are basically personality archetypes written as battle roles. That's why, even now, arguments about the best Kanto Eeveelution often go in circles. Because the argument is rarely about raw stats in a vacuum. It's about what kind of control you value, and what kind of fight you enjoy. There's one more quiet, practical detail about these three that makes them feel like foundational templates. They're all stone evolutions, which means the player controls timing. You can keep Eevee longer, shape its early moves, then lock in the form when it suits you. That timing control is a kind of authorship. You're not just choosing a result, you're choosing when the story turns. And because stone evolution is instant, the turn is sharp enough to feel like a scene change. I used to treat that instant change like a reward. I'd grind, I'd gather money, I'd buy the stone, and then I'd save in front of my menu like I was about to do something irreversible in a much bigger game. That ritual is part of why these three evolutions feel like templates rather than merely options. They're where a lot of players learned that Pokémon is not only about collecting, it's about committing. And once you commit, you live with the shape you chose. That's also why the trio's shared stat total matters so much. Because it protects the emotional integrity of the choice. The game is not tricking you into choosing a bad evolution. It's asking you what kind of strength you want to carry. Later Eeveelutions add more branches, more requirements, more identities, and some of them become just as beloved. But the original trio remains the cleanest demonstration of Eevee's core promise: one base creature, multiple complete destinies. If you understand how Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon function as 3 different solutions to 3 different problems, you're already thinking the way the franchise wants you to think about the rest of the family. When Espeon and Umbreon were introduced, Eevee's evolution stopped being only about what you own. It became about how you raise something, and when you choose to let it change. Generation 2 didn't just add 2 new evolutions to an already popular Pokémon. It added a new kind of requirement, a hidden value tied to companionship, routine, and the small consequences of daily play. The result is that Espeon and Umbreon often feel less like forms you pick and more like outcomes you arrive at. Eevee can still become Vaporeon, Jolteon, or Flareon with stones in Johto-era games, but Espeon and Umbreon require high friendship, and then a level up at the correct time of day. That friendship plus clock pairing is one of the most influential design decisions Pokémon ever made, because it taught players that evolution could be behavioral. Friendship in the main series is not a vague story concept, it's a tracked mechanic, and it changes based on what happens to the Pokémon. The games don't usually show the number directly, but they let you influence it through consistent, repeatable actions. The simplest action is also the most revealing. Keep Eevee in your party, and let it live through your decisions. Walking around with it, winning battles without letting it faint, and using it regularly tend to push friendship upward. Letting it faint, using certain bitter herbal medicines, or generally treating it as disposable, tends to push it downward. Even before you learn the details, the system teaches you a behavioral truth. If you want Espeon or Umbreon, you protect Eevee, and the act of protecting it becomes part of how you remember that evolution. Johto also gives you tools that make friendship feel like something the region understands culturally. There are NPC services that can increase friendship, including grooming-style interactions like haircuts in certain towns. There are characters who will comment on how attached a Pokémon seems, translating a hidden number into a human reaction. That translation matters more than it gets credit for. A hidden value can feel like pure math unless the world reacts to it. Johto makes the world react, so the mechanic feels like a social reality rather than a spreadsheet. Then the clock enters, and the clock is what makes Espeon and Umbreon feel like identities instead of mere upgrades. High friendship plus a level up during the day yields Espeon. High friendship plus a level up at night yields Umbreon. That's a clean rule, but it changes how you play. Suddenly, when I level up, becomes as important as how much experience I have. You start paying attention to time not only for story flavor, but for biology. I remember the first time I tried to force Umbreon and failed. I had done the care part. I was sure of it, and I leveled Eevee up because I couldn't wait any longer. It became Espeon, and the feeling wasn't anger at the game so much as realizing I'd treated the clock like decoration when the game treated it like a law. That experience is a quiet rite of passage in this franchise. It teaches you to respect conditions, to watch the world's systems, and to accept that intention is not enough if you ignore the rules. Eevee becomes the teacher, because Eevee's identity is built around the idea that conditions matter. Espeon and Umbreon also arrive at a moment when Pokémon is broadening what it means for a team to feel raised. Generation A Vaporeon teams often felt assembled, catch, train, evolve. Generation 2 starts nudging you toward teams that feel lived with. The day-night system itself reinforces that, because it changes more than the sky color in some games. It changes wild encounters, certain events, and the overall mood of travel. Tying Eevee to the clock ties Eevee to the region's sense of daily rhythm. Espeon's identity is strongly associated with the day, but it's not written as a simple sun power gimmick. In both design and battle role, Espeon tends to be presented as sharp, fast, and mentally focused. Its psychic typing and stat profile push it towards special offense and tempo, which makes it feel like a precise tool rather than a blunt instrument. Umbreon's identity is the opposite kind of precision. It's built to endure, to wait, to make the opponent run out of clean answers. Its dark typing and defensive lean push it toward patience, which fits the Night Association without needing any supernatural explanation. If you want to see how carefully the series built these two as a pair, look at what they teach alongside each other. Espeon teaches that acting quickly and hitting hard can be its own defense. Umbreon teaches that refusing to break can be a form of control, even when you aren't dealing flashy damage. That pairing adds a new axis to Eevee's family that the original trio doesn't cover. The original trio is about elements and clear archetypes. Espeon and Umbreon are about conditions and relationships, then expressed as a contrast between offensive speed and defensive stability. This is also where Eevee starts to feel like a species the Pokémon world would study seriously. A creature whose evolution can be influenced by emotional state and time of day would be a biological anomaly in-universe, and the games treat it that way by making the methods feel specific enough to be tested and repeated. The games also give Espeon and Umbreon very distinct visual languages that sell their identities instantly. Espeon is sleek and minimal, with a silhouette that reads like a refined, alert animal, and a forehead gem that pulls your attention to mind. Umbreon is darker, heavier in mood, marked by rings that become its signature, and its body language reads more guarded. Those markings aren't just style in the franchise's broader portrayal. Umbreon's ring patterns are treated as a defining feature across media, the kind of trait that makes it recognizable even in simplified art. Espeon's defining features are subtler, which fits its personality framing as quiet focus rather than loud warning. Mechanically, Espeon and Umbreon also become two of the most memorable examples of friendship evolution because their outcomes are so different. Some friendship evolutions in later generations lead to forms that still feel close to the base identity. Espeon and Umbreon feel like a full pivot, which makes the care you invested feel like it produced a new kind of creature, not just a stronger version. A detail that often surprises people revisiting older games is how much your everyday behavior moves the friendship needle. Using items that keep the Pokémon healthy, like certain vitamins, can affect friendship in some generations. Letting the Pokémon walk with you and not faint is not roleplay, it is measurable progress toward the evolution. Conversely, the game will remember if you treat Eevee harshly. Bitter medicinal items that restore health quickly can reduce friendship in many entries, which creates a trade-off between efficiency and bond. That trade-off is one of Pokémon's most quietly effective moral mechanics, because it doesn't lecture you, it simply reflects your choices. Espeon and Umbreon also expose a reality about the franchise that matters for anyone who tries to read it carefully. Pokémon often uses hidden values and indirect feedback rather than explicit meters. Instead of showing you Friendship 2113, it gives you NPC dialogue, subtle cues, and the eventual proof of evolution. That design creates uncertainty in the player, and uncertainty creates attention. You start checking in with NPCs who comment on friendship. Below, you start thinking about how you've been battling and traveling. You start noticing patterns in your own play. That is exactly the kind of engagement these games are built to produce, and Eevee is the cleanest lever they have for it. There's another piece of canonical texture here. Time of day evolution doesn't just require day or night as a mood. It requires the game's internal clock state to match the condition when Eevee levels up. That means the same Eevee can be ready in every way and still not become what you want if the timing is wrong. This is why players developed small rituals around it. Level Eevee up just after the day begins, when you're confident it's daytime. Or wait until deep night, and then do a controlled level up with a safe battle or a rare candy. Those rituals aren't outside the game's logic, they're responses to it. The game teaches you that the final trigger is the level up moment, so you learn to control that moment. That's a very different kind of player skill than win battles, and it's part of why Espeon and Umbreon remain iconic. Their introduction in Generation 2 also coincides with the introduction of Dark-type and Steel-type, which reshaped the battle environment. Umbreon, as a Dark-type, becomes part of the generation's explanation for what Dark means, not necessarily evil, but a category with different interactions and resistances than Psychic. Espeon, as a Psychic type, sits on the other side of that new relationship, and the pair becomes a living demonstration of the new type chart logic. That makes their existence educational in a very Pokémon way. They aren't a tutorial pop-up, they're two creatures whose very presence changes how you understand matchups. Espeon often feels like a bright blade in battle, especially in eras where psychic offense is strong and its speed matters. Umbreon often feels like a lock, a Pokémon designed to remain present and make the opponent's plans feel slower. Even when the competitive landscape changes from generation to generation, that emotional identity tends to persist. Abilities later reinforce these identities further. Espeon's magic bounce, when it is present in the games that feature it, fits the idea of a Pokémon that reflects tricks back at the opponent, like a mind that refuses intrusion. Umbreon's synchronize, commonly associated with it, plays into the idea of shared condition, a bond-like mechanic translated into status interaction. The point isn't that you need to memorize abilities to get these Pokémon. The point is that the franchise keeps aligning the mechanical expression with the narrative vibe. Espeon is written and built to feel alert and reflective. Umbreon is written and built to feel stubborn and enduring. There's also something quietly important about how these evolutions changed how people perceive Eevee itself. In Kanto, Eevee's branching is mostly a matter of taste and team composition. In Johto, Eevee's branching becomes a matter of lifestyle, how you travel, how you treat your partner, and whether you respect the region's cycles. That shift deepens Eevee's overall lore without requiring any new legendary backstory. It turns Eevee from a Pokémon with options into a Pokémon that listens. And once a species is framed that way, every later evolution method, location, move knowledge, new bonding systems feels like part of a consistent story. If you strip it down to its most useful insight, Espeon and Umbreon teach you that the franchise believes environment includes your habits. Your habits produce outcomes. And Eevee is the species that makes that belief visible. A small but important point is that the day-night evolution requirement makes the player pay attention to context. You can't just power level mindlessly if you care about the outcome. You have to look at the world's state, then trigger the change when the state matches your intention. That context awareness becomes even more important later, because Eevee gains location-based evolutions that can override time-based ones. Once you've internalized the Espeon Umbreon method, you're already trained to think, what conditions am I standing in right now? The franchise uses that training to make later branches feel fair instead of arbitrary. I've always liked that the pair also makes Eevee's adaptability feel less like a science experiment and more like a life story. If stones are about exposure to energy, friendship is about exposure to experience. The game effectively argues that the way you're raised is a kind of environment, and Eevee is the species most shaped by it. That's a strong claim for a series that rarely says such things out loud, but it's a claim expressed through outcomes you can reproduce. Raise Eevee. Well, level it at the right time, watch the result. There's also a cultural aftertaste to these evolutions inside the broader franchise. Because Espeon and Umbreon were a major Generation 2 addition, they became tied to the feeling of that era, the sense of returning to Kanto, the sense of time passing, the sense that the world is larger than it looked in the first games. Eevee's new branches felt like proof that Pokémon itself was growing up without abandoning its core. If you're building a mental model of Eeveelutions as a whole, Espeon and Umbreon are the moment Eevee becomes more than a menu choice. They're the moment the series makes Eevee into a test of consistency. Not a difficult test, but a test you can't brute force without paying attention. That consistency theme is what later allows Eevee to carry even more complex evolution requirements without feeling like it's being punished with gimmicks. By the time you're evolving Eevee near specific rocks or under move-related conditions, you've already accepted the premise that Eevee listens to rules. Espeon and Umbreon made those rules feel like a natural part of the world rather than an artificial barrier. And if you keep one idea from this pair, let it be this. In Pokémon, Bond is not just narrative decoration, it's a measurable force the games are willing to treat as biology. Espeon and Umbreon are the cleanest, oldest proof of that, and they're the reason Eevee's family can keep expanding while still feeling like one coherent species. Eevee's first big leap beyond items and time happens the moment the series asks you to care about where you are standing. Not what you used, not how you raised it, but the exact patch of ground where the level up happens. Leafeon and Glaceon arrive as a pair in Generation 4, and they make geography feel like biology. In Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, Eevee evolves into Leafeon by leveling up near a moss rock, and into Glaceon by leveling up near an ice rock. That phrasing sounds tidy until you actually do it, because near becomes a lived experience. A few steps too far and nothing happens. One step closer and the whole line pivots. It's one of the rare moments where the map stops being scenery and starts acting like an invisible machine. Sinnoh is the perfect region to introduce that idea, because Sinnoh is built around locations that feel old and specific. You're constantly moving between places that have distinct moods, distinct music, and distinct weather. So when a rock becomes an evolutionary trigger, it doesn't feel like a gimmick bolted onto the world. It feels like the world revealing a rule you hadn't noticed yet. The Moss Rock in Sinnoh is located in Eterna Forest. Eterna Forest isn't just a forest route. It's that long corridor of trees where the light feels filtered, and the path feels narrow in a way that makes you slow down. If you've ever carried an Eevee through it on purpose, you know the strange way your attention shifts from "where's the exit" to "don't let it level yet." The Ice Rock in Sinnoh is on Route 2117, a place the game turns into an endurance test. Snow reduces visibility, the path drags, and the environment feels actively hostile. And then, in that cold stretch, the Ice Rock sits like a hard fact. The world is cold enough here to change what Eevee becomes. The moment these rocks exist, Eevee's evolution stops being purely personal and starts being ecological. The game is effectively saying, some places contain conditions strong enough to rewrite a body. That idea is consistent with how the series already treats evolution stones. But the delivery is different. Instead of carrying the stimulus, you enter it. I remember the first time I tried to get Glaceon in Sinnoh. It wasn't the difficulty of the method. It's simple once you know it. It was the feeling that I was performing a ritual correctly, like standing in a certain place mattered more than my intent. That's a rare mood for Pokémon, and Eevee is the species that keeps pulling the series into that mood. There's also a mechanical sharpness to these location evolutions that the games never really warn you about with dialogue. If Eevee levels up near the Moss Rock or Ice Rock in the games that use them, that evolution takes priority. So the same Eevee that might otherwise become Espeon by day or Umbreon by night will become Leafeon or Glaceon instead, if you level it up in the rock's vicinity. That priority rule is one of the reasons Leafeon and Glaceon created so many memorable accident stories. A player raises a high friendship Eevee with a specific plan, then walks into Eterna Forest for an unrelated reason, fights a random battle, and watches the plan vanish in a burst of leaves. It's not unfair, but it's the kind of outcome that teaches you the series means what it says about conditions. Once you notice how strict that is, you start playing differently. You begin watching Eevee's experience bar with a kind of cautious respect. You avoid stray battles in certain locations, the same way you avoid stepping on a trap you already discovered. Generation 4 also uses the rocks to make the evolutions feel tied to Sinnoh's identity rather than to Eevee alone. Eterna Forest becomes more than a place with trainers and items. It becomes a place with a biological signature. Route 2117 becomes more than a snowy route. It becomes a climate strong enough to force an evolutionary outcome. Then Unova arrives in Generation 5 and proves the idea isn't just a Sinnoh quirk. Unova also contains a Moss Rock and an Ice Rock, but their placements change the tone. Instead of ancient mountain mystique, Unova gives you places that feel broader, busier, and more like modern geography. In Black and White, the Moss Rock is in Pinwheel Forest. Pinwheel Forest is layered and winding, with paths that feel like they're folding back on themselves. Evolving Eevee there makes Leafeon feel like the result of a living, tangled ecosystem rather than a single enchanted glade. Unova's Ice Rock is inside Twist Mountain. That matters because Twist Mountain has a different kind of cold than Route 217. It isn't open-air blizzard cold. It's enclosed, subterranean cold, the kind you feel in tunnels where the light thins and your footsteps start sounding the same. In practice, Twist Mountain teaches a different version of the same lesson. Location isn't just a surface texture. The game is telling you that ice can be a property of deep places, not only snowy routes. So Glaceon becomes a climate response, not a seasonal costume. Kalos, in Generation 6, continues the rock method, while tying it into a region that feels more curated and storybook-like. Kalos's Moss Rock is in Route 20, Winding Woods. Winding Woods is deliberately disorienting, a place where the forest itself feels like it's testing whether you're paying attention. Finding a rock that triggers Leafeon there is fitting. It turns an already maze-like space into something with a new purpose. Not just escape the woods, but notice the spot where evolution changes. It makes the location feel like it has a secret function. which is exactly the kind of subtle world-building Pokémon does best when it's not shouting. Kalos's Ice Rock is in Frost Cavern, and reaching it requires deeper progression than just walk to a forest. That detail reshapes the feeling of Glaceon in Kalos. Instead of "I can do this as soon as I know," it becomes "I can do this once the region allows me into its coldest interior." When you start tracing these placements across regions, a pattern emerges that's still canon and still visible without fan interpretation. Leafeon is consistently linked to forests or lush spaces. Eterna Forest, Pinwheel Forest, Winding Woods. Glaceon is consistently linked to harsh cold spaces. Route 217's snow, Twist Mountain's depths, Frost Cavern's ice. These aren't random backdrops. They're environmental statements, and Eevee is the species that makes them functional. Then Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire do something quietly important with these evolutions. Original Hoenn, back in the earlier era, didn't have Leafeon or Glaceon at all, because the species didn't exist yet. When the remakes arrive, the region gains the necessary evolutionary landmarks, a moss rock and an ice rock. In Oras, the moss rock is placed in Petalburg Woods. Petalburg Woods is an early game forest, the kind you pass through when your team still feels half-formed. That placement makes Leafeon feel unusually accessible in Hoenn's remake world, like the region is saying, "This is part of the ecosystem now." The ice rock in Oras appears in Shoal Cave, and Shoal Cave is famous for its tide mechanic. That's a detail with teeth, because it means the environment isn't just cold, it's changing. Glaceon's trigger becomes associated not only with ice, but with a place governed by time-based access, which makes it feel like a deliberate region-specific adaptation point. Alola keeps the rock method as well, but reskins the idea through a tropical region that still has sharp environmental contrasts. Alola's moss rock is located in lush jungle, which is exactly what it sounds like, dense, green, alive. If you evolve Eevee there, the transformation doesn't feel like unlocking grass typing. It feels like the jungle leaving a mark. Alola's ice rock is in the cave on Mount Lanakila, the place where the region's cold finally becomes unavoidable. Mount Lanakila has the feeling of a summit where everything is thinner: air, sound, patience. Placing Glaceon's trigger there makes it feel like a high-altitude adaptation in universe, even though the mechanic is still level up by the rock. This is also where Eevee's evolution hierarchy becomes something you can feel if you're the kind of player who tries to satisfy multiple conditions at once. In games with the moss and ice rocks, the rock-triggered evolution overrides the time-based friendship outcomes for Espeon and Umbreon if you level up in the rock's vicinity. So a high friendship Eevee doesn't become whatever it wants, it becomes what the environment demands. When Sylveon enters the family in Generation 6 with its bond and move requirement, the same logic still matters. If you're aiming for Espeon, Umbreon, or Sylveon, you can't treat the map as neutral anymore. The game effectively says, your bond matters, your moves matter, but this location is louder. That's one of the most consistent pieces of Eevee world building across multiple generations. The series treats concentrated environmental stimuli as a dominant factor. It makes Leafeon and Glaceon feel less like new skins and more like the franchise committing to ecology as a real evolutionary driver. Then Generation 8 changes the rules in a way that reveals the franchise's shifting priorities. Starting in Sword and Shield, Leafeon can evolve with a Leaf Stone, and Glaceon can evolve with an Ice Stone. The Moss Rock and Ice Rock method stops being the primary way those evolutions are obtained in the modern baseline. That isn't the series pretending the rocks never existed. It's the series standardizing access in a world where the map structure and player movement have changed, and where tying a form to one precise spot can be more frustrating than meaningful. Eevee's environment evolutions become portable again, returning to the item certainty of the earliest era, just with different stones than Kanto used. The practical effect is that Leafeon and Glaceon shift categories. They began life as geography-dependent evolutions, and then they become stone evolutions in the modern main series. The identity stays the same, forest and frost, but the delivery mechanism changes to match how the games want you to move through their worlds now. If you've been tracking Eevee this whole time, you can feel what that change implies without any developer commentary. Sometimes Pokémon wants evolution to be a place you travel to. Sometimes it wants evolution to be a choice you can make anywhere. Leafeon and Glaceon have now lived through both philosophies, and they're still coherent. That's the hallmark of a well-built concept. The series can change the method while the creature still feels like the same idea. Eevee's adaptability isn't only lore, its evolution system adapts too, and the line stays recognizable as it moves. There's also something quietly important about how the rock method makes you think about the Pokémon world's infrastructure. In-universe, a moss rock or ice rock implies there are sites with concentrated natural forces strong enough to affect evolution. That suggests trainers and researchers would map these places, guard them, or at least talk about them as known phenomena. The games rarely stop for a lecture about that, but the implication is there in the fact that the mechanic is reliable. Reliable phenomena become part of culture. Eevee's environment evolutions hint at a world where certain locations are treated like biological landmarks. It also reframes what training means. Training isn't only battling and leveling. Training can include taking a Pokémon to the right habitat and letting the habitat do part of the work. That idea shows up elsewhere in the franchise too. Certain Pokémon thrive in certain climates. Certain forms are associated with certain areas. But Eevee makes it explicit by tying the outcome to the spot. Leafeon and Glaceon are the clearest proof that the world itself is a participant in evolution, not a stage. When you look at the Eeveelutions as a set, Leafeon and Glaceon also expand the family's emotional palette. The original trio is bright and immediate: water, lightning, fire. Espeon and Umbreon are about daily rhythm and the slow accumulation of bond. Leafeon and Glaceon add something quieter: the patience of place, the idea that a forest and an ice cavern can be stronger influences than your schedule. That makes the family feel more ecological, less like a menu of elements and more like a menu of lives. It's the difference between picking a tool and picking a habitat. Leafeon's identity often reads as life that makes life easier, because its grass association leans into clean air and plant imagery. Glaceon's identity reads as life that makes life sharper, because cold imagery leans into preservation and precision. Those aren't fan poems. They're consistent with how the series tends to frame plant and ice themes in its broader flavor writing. A personal detail I keep coming back to is how these two evolutions change the way you walk. With an Eevee near a rock, you walk like you're carrying something fragile. You count steps, you avoid trainers, you treat random encounters like they're loaded dice. It's a different posture than "I'm grinding levels." It feels closer to guiding a creature through conditions, like you're trying not to trigger the wrong chemical reaction. That physicality of movement is rare in menu-based RPGs, and Eevee is one of the few Pokémon that makes you feel it. And when the evolution finally happens, the transformation feels like confirmation. Not, "I clicked the right item," but "I brought it to the right world." That's why Leafeon and Glaceon remain memorable, even in eras where stones make them easier. The deeper usefulness of understanding Leafeon and Glaceon is that it teaches you how Pokémon negotiates consistency. The franchise wants lore that feels stable, but it also wants mechanics that fit the current game's structure. Eevee is where you can watch that negotiation happen in real time across generations. Leafeon and Glaceon began as geography-dependent evolutions, because the games wanted geography to matter. They later gained stone methods because the games wanted access to be cleaner. Both versions still fit the same canon premise. Eevee reacts strongly to certain stimuli, and stimuli can be delivered by place or by item. That premise is the anchor, and it's why the line doesn't break even when the trigger changes. Eevee's biology, as written, is broad enough to hold multiple delivery systems. That's not an accident. It's the reason Eevee can keep accumulating branches without collapsing into contradiction. Sylveon arrives in Generation 6 with a very particular kind of confidence. Not the confidence of a new legendary or a new battle gimmick, but the confidence of a design that knows it's going to reframe an old idea. Eevee had already proven it could branch through items, through time, and through geography. And then Kalos asked a sharper question: what if evolution is triggered by interaction in a way the player can't pretend is accidental? Because Sylveon is not just the fairy Eeveelution. Sylveon is the moment the franchise welds a new type, a new relationship system, and an old mascot into one cohesive message. Generation 6 introduces the fairy type into the main series, and you can feel immediately that it isn't decorative. Fairy comes with hard mechanical facts that change how battles work. It is immune to dragon-type moves, and it has its own web of strengths, resistances, and weaknesses that immediately matters. The type chart shifts, and Sylveon is one of the cleanest ways the series places that shift directly into a player's hands. If you played through earlier generations, you already know what dragons felt like in practice. They weren't just another type, they were often treated like the apex of late-game power, with a reputation for strong stats and strong moves. Fairy's immunity to dragon doesn't erase dragons, but it changes the emotional feeling of facing them, because it gives players a straightforward defensive answer that didn't exist before. Sylveon, then, is not only a new form, it's a new kind of reassurance. The series is willing to rebalance its own ecosystem, and it's willing to do it through a Pokémon line that already symbolizes adaptation. Eevee becomes the messenger for the type chart itself. But Sylveon's identity isn't carried only by type, it's carried by the method, and the method is one of the most Generation 6 things Pokémon ever did. In X and Y, evolving Eevee into Sylveon requires two conditions that work together. First, Eevee must have high affection, a separate mechanic from traditional friendship in that era. Second, Eevee must know a fairy-type move at the moment it levels up. That seems simple, until you notice what it's really doing to player behavior. A Thunderstone asks you to visit a store. The Moss Rock asks you to visit a location. Sylveon asks you to spend time in a menu where you feed, pet, and interact with your Pokémon. It is evolution as proof that you engaged with the generation's new intimacy system, the part of the game that exists purely to make the Pokémon feel less like a set of stats and more like a partner with preferences. In Kalos, that system is Pokémon Ami. It is not framed as a battle mechanic first, it's framed as interaction. And the fact that Sylveon depends on it makes Sylveon feel like the franchise rewarding attention that isn't strictly tactical. I remember the first time I evolved an Eevee into Sylveon, and realizing the game had made me do something different to earn it. Not grind, not buy, not route hunt, but interact. It felt like the cartridge was quietly saying, you don't get every form by treating Eevee like a tool. The fairy move requirement matters just as much, because it anchors the evolution in a kind of practice becomes body logic. Eevee doesn't become fairy-type because you exposed it to a stone or a rock. It becomes fairy-type because it has developed a fairy expression in its moveset, and because the bond mechanic in that generation has reached a certain level. Inside the series' own worldview, that reads like a training and relationship outcome, you taught it a way of acting, and you treated it in a way the game interprets as care. Then, at Level Up, the moment the Pokémon world uses as its biological turning point, the form locks in. That level up moment is still the trigger, and that's important. Pokémon is consistent about using the level up as the hinge where the body can change. Sylveon doesn't break that, it just makes the prerequisites more personal. There's also a strictness to Sylveon's method that catches people the first time if they aren't careful. In generations where multiple Eevee evolutions might be eligible at once, the game has to decide which one wins. And in the era where affection and fairy moves govern Sylveon, if Eevee meets the Sylveon conditions at level up, it will become Sylveon rather than Espeon or Umbreon. This is one of those rules that feels like a minor technicality until it shapes your story. You can raise an Eevee with high friendship. You can plan for daytime Espeon, and then you can accidentally meet the Sylveon requirement and watch the plan pivot. It's the same kind of conditions are real lesson Leafeon and Glaceon taught, but delivered through bonding and moves instead of geography. The series is essentially ranking signals. Time of day and friendship are strong signals, but a fairy move plus high affection is treated as stronger in the games that use that system. And then, in titles that still have the moss and ice rocks, those location signals can still override everything else if you level up in the right spot. That hierarchy might sound fussy, but it's actually one of the reasons Eevee continues to feel coherent. The game isn't flipping a coin, it's obeying a consistent priority order. When you learn the order, you start planning evolutions like you're navigating a real set of biological forces. Sylveon's design completes the message in a way that's hard to miss even if you don't care about mechanics. Where earlier Eeveelutions exaggerate elemental or ecological traits, fins, spikes, flames, Sylveon exaggerates connection. Its ribbon-like feelers are not passive decoration in the franchise's portrayal. They're treated as part of how it interacts, how it expresses itself, how it reaches. Visually, Sylveon is also a deliberate pivot away from the sharpness stereotype people sometimes attach to power. It looks soft, but it is not designed to look weak. It's designed to look precise, controlled, and intentional, like a creature whose influence is quiet and hard to resist. In battle terms, Sylveon is often associated with special offense and durability in a way that matches its type interactions. Fairy typing itself brings specific resistances and matchups that encourage certain roles, and Sylveon's stat leaning supports that. You don't need to memorize a chart to feel it. You just notice that certain threats stop feeling inevitable when Sylveon is present. Abilities deepen that identity further. Sylveon's standard ability, Cute Charm, fits the idea of a Pokémon that disrupts opponents through proximity and contact. Its hidden ability, Pixelate, is one of the most identity-defining abilities an Eeveelution has ever gotten, because it rewrites normal-type moves into fairy-type power, turning the base normal heritage into fairy expression. That last point is easy to underestimate as lore. Eevee is a normal-type base form, and the series has always treated normal as the flexible template type. Pixelate is basically the game saying, Sylveon doesn't abandon the template, it converts it. It takes the most ordinary moves, normal moves, the language Eevee begins with, and filters them through fairy identity. Mechanically, it's strong. Conceptually, it's elegant, because it makes Sylveon feel like a transformation of the base rather than a costume layered on top. Sylveon also carries the historical weight of being the first Eeveelution introduced after a long gap. From Generation 4 to Generation 6, the family didn't expand, and people got used to the idea that maybe 8 was the ceiling. Then Sylveon arrives and proves the ceiling isn't fixed, which retroactively makes Eevee's unstable genetic structure framing feel less like flavor and more like a promise the franchise is still willing to cash. This is where community discussion becomes unavoidable, not as rumor, but as an observable phenomenon. When Fairy type debuted, it didn't just add a new branch, it changed how players talked about types as a whole, because a new type forces everyone to recalibrate intuition. Sylveon became a symbol of that recalibration in a way very few new Pokémon do, because it was both familiar and disruptive at the same time. There's also a story-level neatness to how Kalos positions Sylveon's method. Kalos is the region that leans hard into presentation, fashion, performance, the idea that how you interact matters. A new evolution tied to affection and interaction fits that world's vibe without needing the game to explain it in dialogue. And the franchise doesn't treat that method as a one-off. In Generation 7, Pokémon Refresh replaces Pokémon Amy's exact framing, but the underlying idea remains. You can interact with your Pokémon, and that interaction has mechanical consequences. Sylveon continues to be tied to that interaction-driven bond requirement in that era's mainline logic. Then Generation 8 makes a clean, important change that tells you something about how Pokémon thinks about hidden meters over time. From Sword and Shield onward, the series shifts away from the separate affection gate as a requirement for Sylveon's evolution, and leans back into the broader friendship concept, while keeping the fairy move requirement. The evolution remains behavioral, but it becomes less dependent on a specific side mode interface. This is one of those changes that's easy to describe as simplifying, but it has a deeper effect on what Sylveon represents. In Kalos, Sylveon is proof you use the new interaction system. In later eras, Sylveon becomes proof you raised Eevee well in a more general sense, while still expressing fairy identity through a learned move. So Sylveon's method shifts from engage with this generation's bonding feature to maintain a bond the series already tracks. That change keeps Sylveon accessible in games where the bonding UI is different, smaller, or simply not emphasized the same way. It's Eevee's evolution system, adapting to the franchise's evolving understanding of how much hidden complexity players actually enjoy managing. Through all of this, the central identity stays stable. Sylveon is the fairy branch of a line defined by responsiveness. It is triggered by bond and expression, how close you are, and what kind of move language Eevee has learned. That makes Sylveon a fascinating contrast with Espeon and Umbreon. Espeon and Umbreon are bond plus clock, as if routine and time shape the outcome. Sylveon is Bond plus Move, as if practiced expression shapes the outcome. Both are canon ways Pokémon argues that training is not only physical, it's behavioral and contextual. And because Sylveon is tied to the fairy type's debut, it carries the added weight of being a design statement. The series can still add new fundamental categories, and it can do it without discarding what came before. If you step back and take the researcher's view, Sylveon is the point where Eevee becomes the franchise's most reliable bridge between systems. New type, Eevee can express it. New interaction mechanic, Eevee can be evolved through it. New balance goal, Eevee can embody it in a form that millions of players will immediately care about. That's not hype. It's simply what the line has done repeatedly across generations. And there's a final practical reason Sylveon matters even if you never touch competitive play. Sylveon teaches you to read evolution requirements as a language. Stones are nouns you collect. Time is a state you schedule. Locations are coordinates you visit. And moves are verbs you practice. Sylveon is the branch that makes practice part of evolution's grammar in the most explicit way. You want the fairy outcome, you teach fairy expression, and you raise the bond high enough that the game recognizes it. Then the level up locks it in, like a signature at the bottom of a document you've been writing with your behavior. Sylveon sits right at the pivot between new system showcase and long-term stable biology, and it manages to be both without breaking. That is the hallmark of Eevee as a franchise tool. It can carry a generational message, then later become timeless once the message has served its purpose. You can evolve Sylveon today under different exact rules than you did in Kalos, and it still feels like the same creature that emerges for the same reason: bond plus fairy expression. Abilities are one of the most honest forms of Pokémon storytelling, because they can't rely on cutscenes or poetic text. So when you look at Eevee and its evolutions through abilities, you're looking at the franchise explaining identity in pure mechanics. An ability has to do something repeatable in battle. Eevee's own ability. History starts simple, then becomes quietly revealing as the series evolves. For a long time, Eevee's standard abilities have included Runaway and Adaptability. Runaway is almost comically literal for a small, cautious creature, and it frames Eevee's base form as survival first, the kind of Pokémon that chooses escape over confrontation when it can. Adaptability is the more important one from a lore meets mechanics perspective. It boosts the power of moves that match the Pokémon's own type, which for Eevee means normal type moves become unusually effective. That's a beautiful mechanical metaphor. Even before Eevee transforms into other types, it is already built to specialize into whatever it currently is. Eevee's hidden ability, Anticipation, adds a different flavor. It doesn't increase damage or speed, it reacts to danger. In-world, it reads like heightened sensitivity, a creature that can sense threatening moves and flinch with warning. And every one of those identities fits the idea of a creature defined by adaptability. So even before you evolve it, the game gives you 3 potential identities for Eevee's core: cautious escape, efficient specialization, or nervous foresight. When you evolve Eevee into the original trio, the abilities become one of the clearest examples of the franchise locking theme into function. Vaporeon commonly carries Water Absorb as its standard ability. That means water doesn't just fail to harm it, water heals it. If you interpret that through the ecological lens, it's perfect. The ability turns habitat into fuel. Vaporeon is not merely resistant to water, it benefits from it the way an aquatic organism benefits from its own environment. Jolteon commonly carries Volt Absorb, which is the exact same idea translated into electricity. Electric attacks become healing. The body is not only insulated, it is built to harvest charge. Flareon commonly carries Flash Fire, and again the pattern holds. Fire doesn't just fail, it becomes a boost. That trio of absorb-boost abilities is one of the cleanest pieces of mechanical symbolism in Pokémon. It's the trilogy of become the element strongly enough that the element stops being a threat. It tells you, without any lore text, what the stone evolution is supposed to mean. Commitment. Not I learned a water trick, but I rewrote my body, so water is now my ally. When hidden abilities enter the ecosystem, the trio gains a second identity layer that's less about immunity and more about personality. Vaporeon's hidden ability, Hydration, ties it to rain and cleansing. reinforcing water as an environmental partner. Jolteon's hidden ability, Quick Feet, is pure tempo. Status conditions become fuel for speed, which matches Jolteon's identity as a creature that converts stress into motion. Flareon's hidden ability, Guts, is pure grit. Being afflicted makes it hit harder. That is Flareon's stored heat, translated into psychology. Pain becomes pressure. Pressure becomes output. Even if you never use those hidden abilities in a playthrough, they still matter as canon flavor. They show what the designers think these creatures are at a behavioral level. Then you move into Espeon and Umbreon, and the abilities start telling an even more specific story about mind and defense. Vaporeon aligns with weather and renewal. Jolteon aligns with frantic momentum. Flareon aligns with stubborn intensity. Espeon commonly carries Synchronize as a standard ability. Synchronize reflects certain status conditions back to the opponent, which fits the idea of a psychic creature that mirrors influence. It's a quiet form of control. You don't have to strike first if you can punish interference. Espeon's hidden ability, Magic Bounce, is one of the most identity-defining abilities in the entire Eevee line. It reflects many non-damaging trick moves back at the user. Mechanically, it means Espeon is a creature that refuses manipulation, a mind that turns the opponent's plans back on them. That fits Espeon's vibe perfectly. Sleek, alert, and hard to cheat. It's not a brute force ability, it's a boundary. And boundaries are exactly what Espeon's method Bond plus Day feels like. A controlled, refined outcome. Umbreon also commonly carries Synchronize as a standard ability, and that shared ability matters. It implies that the psychic dark pair are not opposites in every sense. They share a core trait. They mirror conditions. The line suggests that Espeon and Umbreon are two outcomes of the same bond foundation expressed in different directions. Umbreon's other standard ability, Inner Focus, reinforces its identity as a Pokémon that doesn't flinch. Umbreon is framed as the form that endures stress without cracking. That's not just mechanical sturdiness, it's emotional stubbornness. Umbreon's hidden ability, Prankster, is one of the most revealing examples of how abilities can reshape a Pokémon's identity in certain eras. Prankster gives priority to certain non-damaging moves, which turns Umbreon from pure endurance into a creature that can control tempo through tactics. It fits the Dark type's broader theme in the series. Not evil, but indirect, strategic, disruptive. When Leafeon and Glaceon arrive, abilities keep acting like ecosystem fingerprints. Leafeon commonly carries Leaf Guard as a standard ability, tying it to sunlight and environmental safety. That's a clear link to plant logic. Under sun, the body protects itself from status effects. That's a plant metaphor, turned into battle tempo. More sun, more energy, more motion. Leafeon's other standard ability, Chlorophyll, boosts speed in sunlight. It's the healthy in the right light idea expressed as a rule. It's the franchise saying Leafeon is not only a grass creature, it's a creature whose body is literally sun-responsive. Leafeon's hidden ability, Anticipation, loops back to Eevee's hidden ability, creating a genetic echo. It suggests that even after specialization, some evolutions still carry that base sensitivity to danger. In world terms, it feels like the trait survived the rewrite. It's a climate ability. The body becomes harder to track in the weather it belongs to. Glaceon commonly carries Snow Cloak, tying it to evasiveness in hail or snow conditions. Glaceon's other standard ability, Ice Body, heals it in hail, which is essentially the ice version of the environment feeds me. Glaceon's hidden ability, Ice Body, depending on era distribution or other ability assignments, reinforces that cold is nourishment theme. The details of which ability is standard or hidden can vary by generation and availability method, but the identity theme stays stable. Glaceon is written as a creature that benefits from cold rather than merely tolerating it. Then Sylveon arrives and abilities become almost narratively explicit. Cute Charm is not raw power, it's disruption through interaction. Sylveon's standard ability, Cute Charm, is the franchise making its intent obvious. This is a form built around influence and contact. Abilities are one of the most honest forms of Pokémon storytelling, because they can't rely on cutscenes or poetic text. An ability has to do something repeatable in battle. So when you look at Eevee and its evolutions through abilities, You're looking at the franchise explaining identity in pure mechanics. Eevee's own ability. History starts simple, then becomes quietly revealing as the series evolves. For a long time, Eevee's standard abilities have included Runaway and Adaptability. Runaway is almost comically literal for a small, cautious creature, and it frames Eevee's base form as survival first, the kind of Pokémon that chooses escape over confrontation when it can. Adaptability is the more important one from a lore meets mechanics perspective. It boosts the power of moves that match the Pokémon's own type, which for Eevee means normal type moves become unusually effective. That's a beautiful mechanical metaphor. Even before Eevee transforms into other types, it is already built to specialize into whatever it currently is. Eevee's hidden ability, Anticipation, adds a different flavor. It doesn't increase damage or speed, it reacts to danger. In-world, it reads like heightened sensitivity, a creature that can sense threatening moves and flinch with warning. So even before you evolve it, the game gives you 3 potential identities for Eevee's core: cautious escape, efficient specialization, or nervous foresight. And every one of those identities fits the idea of a creature defined by adaptability. When you evolve Eevee into the original trio, the abilities become one of the clearest examples of the franchise locking theme into function. Vaporeon commonly carries Water Absorb as its standard ability. That means water doesn't just fail to harm it, water heals it. If you interpret that through the ecological lens, it's perfect. Vaporeon is not merely resistant to water, it benefits from it the way an aquatic organism benefits from its own environment. The ability turns habitat into fuel. Jolteon commonly carries Volt Absorb, which is the exact same idea translated into electricity. Electric attacks become healing. The body is not only insulated, it is built to harvest charge. Flareon commonly carries Flash Fire, and again the pattern holds. Fire doesn't just fail, it becomes a boost. It's the trilogy of become the element strongly enough that the element stops being a threat. That trio of absorb boost abilities is one of the cleanest pieces of mechanical symbolism in Pokémon. It tells you, without any lore text, what the stone evolution is supposed to mean. Commitment. Not I learned a water trick, but I rewrote my body, so water is now my ally. When hidden abilities enter the ecosystem, the trio gains a second identity layer that's less about immunity and more about personality. Vaporeon's hidden ability, Hydration, ties it to rain and cleansing, reinforcing water as an environmental partner. Jolteon's hidden ability, Quick Feet, is pure tempo. Status conditions become fuel for speed, which matches Jolteon's identity as a creature that converts stress into motion. Flareon's hidden ability, Guts, is pure grit. Being afflicted makes it hit harder. That is Flareon's stored heat, translated into psychology. Pain becomes pressure. Pressure becomes output. Even if you never use those hidden abilities in a playthrough, they still matter as canon flavor. They show what the designers think these creatures are at a behavioral level. Vaporeon aligns with weather and renewal, Jolteon aligns with frantic momentum, Flareon aligns with stubborn intensity. Then you move into Espeon and Umbreon, and the abilities start telling an even more specific story about mind and defense. Espeon commonly carries Synchronize as a standard ability. Synchronize reflects certain status conditions back to the opponent, which fits the idea of a psychic creature that mirrors influence. It's a quiet form of control. You don't have to strike first if you can punish interference. Espeon's hidden ability, Magic Bounce, is one of the most identity-defining abilities in the entire Eevee line. It reflects many non-damaging trick moves back at the user. Mechanically, it means Espeon is a creature that refuses manipulation, a mind that turns the opponent's plans back on them. That fits Espeon's vibe perfectly. Sleek, alert, and hard to cheat. It's not a brute force ability, it's a boundary. And boundaries are exactly what Espeon's method Bond plus Day feels like. A controlled, refined outcome. Umbreon also commonly carries Synchronize as a standard ability, and that shared ability matters. It implies that the psychic dark pair are not opposites in every sense. They share a core trait. They mirror conditions. The line suggests that Espeon and Umbreon are two outcomes of the same bond foundation expressed in different directions. Umbreon's other standard ability, Inner Focus, reinforces its identity as a Pokémon that doesn't flinch. That's not just mechanical sturdiness, it's emotional stubbornness. Umbreon is framed as the form that endures stress without cracking. Umbreon's hidden ability, Prankster, is one of the most revealing examples of how abilities can reshape a Pokemon's identity in certain eras. Prankster gives priority to certain non-damaging moves, which turns Umbreon from pure endurance into a creature that can control tempo through tactics. It fits the Dark type's broader theme in the series. Not evil, but indirect, strategic, disruptive. When Leafeon and Glaceon arrive, abilities keep acting like ecosystem fingerprints. Leafeon commonly carries Leaf Guard as a standard ability, tying it to sunlight and environmental safety. That's a clear link to plant logic. Under sun, the body protects itself from status effects. It's the healthy in the right light idea expressed as a rule. Leafeon's other standard ability, Chlorophyll, boosts speed in sunlight. That's a plant metaphor, turned into battle tempo. More sun, more energy, more motion. It's the franchise saying Leafeon is not only a grass creature, it's a creature whose body is literally sun-responsive. Leafeon's hidden ability, Anticipation, loops back to Eevee's hidden ability, creating a genetic echo. It suggests that even after specialization, some evolutions still carry that base sensitivity to danger. In world terms, it feels like the trait survived the rewrite. Glaceon commonly carries Snow Cloak, tying it to evasiveness in hail or snow conditions. It's a climate ability. The body becomes harder to track in the weather it belongs to. Glaceon's other standard ability, Ice Body, heals it in hail, which is essentially the ice version of the environment feeds me. Glaceon's hidden ability, Ice Body, depending on era distribution or other ability assignments, reinforces that cold is nourishment theme. The details of which ability is standard or hidden can vary by generation and availability method, but the identity theme stays stable. Glaceon is written as a creature that benefits from cold rather than merely tolerating it. Then Sylveon arrives and abilities become almost narratively explicit. Sylveon's standard ability, Cute Charm, is the franchise making its intent obvious. This is a form built around influence and contact. Cute Charm is not raw power, it's disruption through interaction. It's consistent with Sylveon's visual language of feelers and ribbons, a creature that reaches and affects. Sylveon's hidden ability, Pixelate, is one of the most thematically perfect hidden abilities in the entire line. It changes normal-type moves into fairy-type moves and boosts them, which is basically Eevee's origin being transmuted into a new identity. The base type becomes the fuel for the new type. If you step back and look at the full set, abilities show that Eeveelutions are designed as complete answers rather than half-formed concepts. The type is not only a label, it's a set of interactions that abilities reinforce. Water heals water, electricity heals electricity, sun accelerates plants, snow cloaks ice, psychic reflects manipulation, fairy converts the normal into the magical. Hidden abilities add a second layer that often reveals how the designers want you to imagine the creature's temperament under stress. Jolteon runs faster when afflicted. Flareon hits harder when hurt. Espeon refuses interference. Umbreon resists flinching, and in some contexts becomes a tactical disruptor. These are behavioral stories told through battle triggers. The most useful insight from all of this is that Eevee's family is one of the clearest examples of identity alignment in Pokémon design. The evolution method teaches a theme, the Pokédex justifies it, and the abilities make it functional. When those three layers point in the same direction, the evolution feels inevitable rather than arbitrary. And Eevee is the one line where you can watch that alignment happen repeatedly, without needing speculation. If you want to understand how Pokémon communicates what a creature is, don't only read the lore or only look at the stats. Look at the abilities. Abilities are where the franchise is forced to be honest, because they have to do something that the game can enforce. Eevee's family, more than almost any other, uses that honesty to turn theme into function. Abilities also reveal a quieter truth about Eevee's family. Each evolution doesn't just gain a type, it gains a relationship to that type's risks. With Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon, the pattern is almost too clean to be accidental. Water Absorb, Volt Absorb, and Flash Fire all turn the element into safety, then into benefit. That's the franchise telling you that Stone Evolution is a commitment so deep it rewrites what danger even means. When you replay older games, you can feel how that changes your posture in battle. A water-type attack stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a resource you can invite. The same move the opponent thinks is pressure becomes a small refill, like the world briefly tilting in your favor because your biology is aligned. That alignment is the real narrative hidden in the ability slot. Pokémon rarely tells you in dialogue, this creature's body harvests its own element. It just enforces the rule, and the rule becomes the story you experience repeatedly. Hidden abilities deepen that story, because they often show what the evolution looks like under stress. Vaporeon's hydration is water as cleansing and reset, the idea that rain doesn't inconvenience it. Rain restores it. Jolteon's quick feet is the idea that discomfort becomes acceleration, that being hindered only makes it harder to catch. Flareon's guts is the bluntest of all. Pain becomes power. It's a personality trait expressed as math, and it makes Flareon feel like a creature that doesn't simply endure heat, but endures hardship with the same internal furnace. Even if you never run that ability in a serious battle, it still teaches you what the designers think Flareon is supposed to feel like. That feel layer is why abilities matter more than people admit. Stats tell you what a Pokémon can do in ideal conditions. Abilities tell you what a Pokémon does when the situation gets messy. Espeon is a perfect example of that difference. Synchronize already suggests a reflective mirror-like mind, a Pokémon that doesn't just receive conditions but shares them. Then Magic Bounce makes the message unmistakable. Espeon rejects interference. It's hard to read Magic Bounce as anything other than a boundary. It turns the opponent's attempt to control the field into a mistake. In practice, it feels like placing Espeon on the battlefield and watching the room become quieter, because certain cheap tricks stop working the moment it arrives. Umbreon's ability story is quieter, but it's just as deliberate. Umbreon's ability list centers on endurance and composure, and its hidden ability is Inner Focus. Inner Focus is a small sentence in an ability box, but the lived experience is simple. Umbreon does not like being shaken. That fits Umbreon's entire silhouette and battle rhythm. It's a night-evolved form that wins by staying present, and Inner Focus supports that identity in the cleanest way possible. Not with a dramatic boost, but with a refusal to be interrupted. Leafeon and Glaceon take the same identity alignment approach and attach it directly to weather and light. Leafeon's Leaf Guard and Chlorophyll are both sunlight statements. One protects, the other accelerates. They're two sides of the same plant logic: safety in proper conditions and speed in proper conditions. If you've ever used Leafeon in a sun-focused team, the ability doesn't feel like a bonus. It feels like the creature is finally in the environment its body was designed for, like it's breathing the right air. That's the same storytelling trick as Water Absorb, just expressed through weather instead of direct elemental attacks. Glaceon does the ice version of that story through Snow Cloak and Ice Body. Snow Cloak makes the creature harder to pin down in its own weather, and Ice Body turns hail into recovery. The message is consistent with every other evolution template. Specialization turns environment from threat into advantage. Then Sylveon arrives, and the ability design gets almost philosophical. Cute Charm is the surface-level statement. This form influences through contact and presence. Pixelate is the deeper statement. Sylveon converts the normal heritage into fairy expression. That conversion is one of the most important Eevee line ideas ever put into mechanics. Eevee begins as normal type, the baseline language of the series. Pixelate takes that language and translates it, so the old vocabulary becomes new power without pretending the origin never existed. If you only ever take one technical insight from abilities, it's this: abilities are where Pokémon sneaks in its best world building without writing a single paragraph of lore. They are enforced truths. They're the closest thing the franchise has to physics. And once you accept abilities as physics, you start noticing family patterns the way a biologist would. Some abilities repeat across related forms, like genetic echoes. Others form thematic sets, like the Elemental Immunity Trio, which reads like three branches of the same ancestral adaptation. Eevee itself fits into this pattern more than it seems at first glance. Runaway says survival first, a small creature whose best strategy is to exit. Adaptability says specialize into whatever you are right now, which is basically Eevee's entire identity compressed into one word. Anticipation adds the last piece, sensitivity. It's the base form reacting to danger before it arrives, like the nervous system is tuned to notice threats. That ability feels like the seed that later becomes different kinds of confidence in the evolutions. Vaporeon's calm endurance, Jolteon's frantic speed, Espeon's refusal of interference, Umbreon's composure. There's another layer abilities reveal that's easy to miss if you only look at a single game. Eevee's family keeps its identity coherent across decades because abilities create constraints that keep the fantasy honest. If Vaporeon is supposed to be aquatic, the ability doesn't let it be aquatic in name only. If Glaceon is supposed to belong to snow, the ability doesn't let snow be neutral. It turns snow into a mechanical home field. The creature isn't merely themed, it's reinforced. This is also why arguments about which evolution is best often turn into arguments about what kind of advantage you trust. Some players trust raw speed and first strikes. Some trust slow advantage, healing, and inevitability. Abilities are the part of the kit that often decides which kind of advantage a form is built to create. Jolteon's identity, for example, is not only fast electric, it's also the kind of organism that converts pressure into movement, which is a very different kind of fantasy than the kind of organism that converts environment into healing. And that difference matters when you're trying to understand why the Eevee line stays culturally alive. The line doesn't only offer 8 aesthetics, it offers 8 different ways of relating to risk. In practical play, risk is everything. Do you want to absorb it, reflect it, outrun it, or ignore it? Each evolution tends to answer that question with its stat profile, but abilities are where the answer becomes unavoidable. You can see it in the way battles change the moment you reveal an ability. The opponent throws a water move at Vaporeon and discovers it heals you, and suddenly the opponent has to rethink their plan. That rethink is the story, and it happens without a narrator. The same is true for Magic Bounce on Espeon. The first time someone tries to lay a trap, inflict a status, or control the field and it flips back, the battlefield feels like it has rules the opponent didn't respect. Espeon doesn't look louder than other Pokémon, but its ability makes it feel like it owns the conversation. Umbreon's inner focus is less theatrical, but it has its own lived narrative. It's the Pokémon that keeps acting even when the opponent tries to make it hesitate. That reliability is a personality trait you can feel, especially in longer fights where interruptions usually decide momentum. Leafeon and Glaceon, meanwhile, teach you to think in terms of conditions you can create. Sun isn't only nice weather, it becomes a lever that changes what Leafeon can do. Snow isn't only cold, it becomes a lever that changes how Glaceon survives. That's where Eevee's line starts resembling an ecosystem study. You don't only choose a form, you choose what kind of conditions you want to thrive in. Abilities make that choice concrete. Hidden abilities also quietly reinforce the idea that a species can contain multiple behavioral phenotypes under the same form. 2 Vaporeon can both be Vaporeon, but the way they function under rain can be different. That's not headcanon, it's literally what the ability slot represents. Alternate biological wiring, expressed as different rules. In the real world, that would be a genetics conversation. In Pokémon, it becomes a repeatable property that changes battles. The franchise doesn't need to explain it further, because it already has a perfect metaphor. Different abilities, same species. This matters for Eevee more than for most lines, because Eevee's entire brand is variability under conditions. Abilities are variability under conditions, but inside a single form, so Eevee ends up being variable in 2 directions at once. Which form it becomes, and which wiring it carries inside that form. If you're the kind of viewer who likes to take something useful away from lore, here's the clean takeaway. Eevee's line is one of the best ways to learn how Pokémon communicates identity through systems, method, type, stats, move access, and ability, all align. When you understand that alignment, you stop seeing evolutions as arbitrary, and you start seeing them as design arguments the game enforces. That's also why the line remains so easy to talk about without sounding like you're just listing facts, because each form is a coherent concept that repeats itself in multiple layers. Vaporeon isn't only water type, it is water as home. Jolteon isn't only electric type, it is voltage as tension and release. Flareon isn't only fire type, it is heat as stored pressure. Espeon isn't only psychic type, it is mind as boundary. Eevee isn't only dark type, it is endurance as refusal to be shaken. Leafeon isn't only grass type, it is sunlight as metabolism. Glaceon isn't only ice type, it is cold as shelter. Sylveon isn't only fairy type, it is influence as translation of the ordinary into the new. Abilities don't create those identities, but they make them unavoidable. They make sure the creature behaves the way the idea claims it should behave. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. You start reading ability names like field notes. You start hearing a little thesis behind each one, like the designers are whispering, "This is how this organism survives." Moves are where the Eevee line stops being an idea and becomes a set of habits. Typing tells you what a Pokémon is, but a learn set tells you what a Pokémon actually does turn after turn. And across generations, the Eevee family has been used to teach a very specific rule. Each evolution isn't just a new coat of paint, it's a new vocabulary. Eevee's own move pool begins with the language of a small normal type that survives by being broadly competent. You see staples like quick contact moves, basic biting attacks, and utility options that don't belong to one element. That baseline matters because it's the common tongue every evolution inherits in some form, either directly or as a memory of what it used to be. Then the franchise adds a second layer that makes Eevee's identity unusually clear. Eevee has always been a pivot point between offense and support. On one end, it learns straightforward damage tools that make it usable even before evolving. On the other end, it gains access to a surprisingly influential set of support moves that can shape battles even when Eevee itself isn't the star. This is where moves like Wish become iconic to Eevee's broader story. Wish is not an elemental move, not a flashy signature beam, but it fits Eevee perfectly because it feels like deferred intention. You act now, the effect arrives later, and that later becomes a kind of rhythm you build around. The line also leans into Baton Pass in the eras where that move exists as a transferable strategy tool. It's thematically perfect for a branching evolution family. Momentum, stat changes, and positioning being handed off like inheritance. Even when rule environments change around that move across the franchise's history, its association with Eevee as a connector Pokémon makes intuitive sense. Eevee's move identity also includes the idea of commitment, through delayed power, and Last Resort is the cleanest example. Last Resort only works after the Pokémon has used all its other moves, which makes it feel like a final card you don't flip early. It turns Eevee into something you have to pilot with patience, which matches the species' lore of potential and thresholds. Then there's a move that almost feels like the franchise signing Eevee's name on the page, Covet. A small creature that can snatch items fits the survivor vibe of Eevee's base form, and it reinforces Eevee as an early game companion that interacts with the world's material rules. It's not a legendary move, but it's a move that makes Eevee feel alive in the economy of items and objects. Once you evolve, the line becomes stricter, and that strictness is intentional. Most Eeveelutions don't keep expanding into huge cross-type coverage the way some other Pokémon families do. They become specialists, and their learn sets reinforce that specialization by leaning hard into their elemental or conceptual identity. The most important historical breakpoint for how Eeveelutions feel in battle is the physical/special split that arrives in Generation 4. Before that, whether a move used the physical or special attacking stat depended on the move's type rather than the move itself. After the split, each move is categorized individually, and that single change reshapes how several Eeveelutions express their identity. It's easiest to feel with Flareon, because Flareon's defining strength is physical attack. In the old system, many fire-type attacks function through the special category, which created a mismatch between the fantasy of a heavy hitter and the way the math asked it to fight. Once move categories become individual, Flareon gets to express fire through physical attacks in a way that finally matches its body language. Vaporeon and Jolteon also change under that split, but more gently. Vaporeon's water identity often expresses through special attacks and endurance tools, which align comfortably with its stat lean and typical move choices. Jolteon's electric identity, often expresses through fast special pressure, and the split doesn't interrupt that core feeling of act first, punish second. Espeon and Umbreon are another clean pair for seeing how learn sets encode temperament. Espeon's move identity leans into psychic offense and control tools that feel precise rather than explosive. It's the kind of Pokémon whose best turns often feel like a clean cut, one decisive action that makes the opponent's plans smaller. Umbreon's move identity is often the opposite kind of control, prolonging, weakening, and outlasting. It gains access to tools that reduce offense, sustain itself, and force the opponent into longer sequences where mistakes accumulate. Umbreon doesn't need a dramatic signature nuke to feel powerful, because its learns it can make the opponent's strongest turns feel irrelevant. Leafeon and Glaceon take the same specialist vocabulary idea and map it onto two different environmental moods. Leafeon's identity tends to lean toward clean, sharp physical grass offense and self-support options that make it feel like a focused duelist. Glaceon tends to lean toward ice offense and cold-themed coverage that makes it feel like a specialist designed to punish specific threats decisively. Sylveon's learned set identity is where voice becomes literal. Fairy as a type comes with a toolkit that mixes pressure with control, and Sylveon's access to major fairy attacks gives it a language that feels both elegant and forceful. And when Sylveon carries Pixelate, a normal move can become a fairy expression, which makes the move pool feel like translation rather than replacement. One reason the Eevee line stays so replayable is that Eevee itself can act like a move nursery before you evolve it. In many games, you can delay evolution to shape Eevee's early move memory, then evolve into a form that benefits from the foundation you built. This is part of why stone evolutions and conditional evolutions feel different in practice. The method influences not just what you become, but what you learned on the way. That effect becomes even more obvious when you look at game-specific move systems, TMs, tutors, reminders, and egg move inheritance. Eevee's egg move pool has often included supportive, identity-defining options that aren't locked to one element. Those moves function like genetic tools that the evolutions can reinterpret, making two Pokémon of the same form feel genuinely different depending on what they inherited. There's also a canonical moment where the franchise makes Eevee's move identity impossibly explicit. Extreme Evo Boost, Eevee's Z move when holding Eeveeum Z in the Alola era. It raises all of Eevee's stats sharply in one action, which is basically the idea of potential turned into a button press. It's the series saying, in the most mechanical language possible, that Eevee's theme is not one element, it's escalation under the right trigger. Then Let's Go takes a different approach and gives the partner Eevee its own exclusive move kit that can't be mistaken for anything else. Partner Eevee learns a set of special moves like Bouncy Bubble, Buzzy Buzz, Sizzly Slide, Glitzy Glow, Batty Bad, Sappy Seed, Freezy Frost, Sparkly Swirl, and the heavy-hitting Vivi Volley. Those moves are effectively portable Eeveelutions, letting an unevolved Eevee express multiple elemental identities without actually branching, which fits that game's decision to keep the partner Eevee unevolved. That design is an important piece of canon because it shows the franchise experimenting with a question it usually avoids. What if the potential stays in the base form, instead of being resolved into a single destiny? The answer, at least in that specific format, is give Eevee a moveset that behaves like a whole family. Sword and Shield introduces another official twist on Eevee's move identity through Gigantamax. A Gigantamax-capable Eevee can't evolve, and it gains access to its own G-Max move, G-Max Cuddle. So again, the franchise repeats the same trade-off in a different costume. You can have branching potential, or you can have a unique Eevee as itself power expression, but not both in that specific case. Across all these eras, the Eevee line's learn set philosophy stays consistent. Eevee starts broad enough to feel like a real companion, not a placeholder. Then each evolution narrows the vocabulary to make the identity feel specialized, readable, and repeatable in battle. That narrowing is part of what keeps the family from blurring together. Vaporeon doesn't just look aquatic, it fights like it belongs in water-themed logic. Jolteon doesn't just look charged, it fights like it wants tempo and pressure. Flareon doesn't just look warm, it fights like it's built around decisive force once the rules allow it to express that force cleanly. Espeon fights like a boundary and a blade. Umbreon fights like a door that won't open. Leafeon fights like a clean strike in sunlight logic. Glaceon fights like cold certainty. Sylveon fights like translation, the ordinary turned into fairy expression. It tends to have access to psychic offense that reads like a sharp instrument rather than a blunt wave. The result is a Pokémon whose best turns often feel like they reduce chaos. One action that clarifies the battlefield by removing a threat or denying a line. When Espeon is working as intended, it doesn't feel like it's surviving by luck. It feels like it's surviving by being ahead of the opponent's shape. That's a learned set mood as much as it is a stat mood. Umbreon lives in the opposite mood. Long sequences, repeated turns, and tools that make the opponent's damage feel smaller than it should. Its move pool supports the idea that winning can look like staying, not the flashy kind of staying, but the stubborn, patient kind, where the opponent's plan becomes exhausted. Umbreon is also where the Eevee line's move identity often overlaps with the idea of maintenance. Rather than hunting one big finishing move, Umbreon tends to hunt structure, repeatable turns, predictable recovery, predictable pressure. That predictability is why people remember Umbreon's battles as stories, not snapshots. Leafeon and Glaceon are fascinating, because their move identities reinforce the environment evolutions theme even after the games stop requiring Moss Rock and Ice Rock. Leafeon's vocabulary tends to feel like clean physical grass offense and self-sharpening tools, which matches the impression of a creature designed for direct, efficient strikes. Glaceon's vocabulary tends to feel like cold certainty, ice attacks that punish specific targets hard, paired with the kind of coverage that makes a cold specialist feel complete. And then Sylveon sits in a different register entirely. Sylveon's move pool isn't just fairy moves, it's fairy moves plus translation, because the line's normal heritage remains present in the way Sylveon can express power through moves that began life as ordinary. That's why Sylveon's relationship with moves can feel more symbolic than the others. With Vaporeon, you become water. With Jolteon, you become voltage. With Sylveon, you become an interpreter. The same old words can mean something new once the evolution locks in. This is also the heading where the Eevee line's obscure but canon move trivia starts to matter, because the franchise has repeatedly treated Eevee as a platform for special move experiments. One of the cleanest examples is Extreme Evoboost, Eevee's exclusive Z move, when used with Eeveeum Z in the Alola era. It sharply raises Eevee's attack, defense, special, defense, and speed all at once. That is potential turned into a single action. A move that says Eevee's identity is not one element, but the ability to become more than its current shape. What makes Extreme Evoboost feel especially Eevee is that it doesn't look like a Vaporeon move or a Jolteon move. It looks like a line-wide thesis statement. It's the series admitting that Eevee's concept is valuable enough to deserve its own mechanical climax. Then Let's Go takes the thesis in a different direction by refusing to let the partner Eevee evolve at all, and compensating with a set of partner-exclusive moves that effectively simulate the whole family. Partner Eevee can learn Bouncy Bubble, Buzzy Buzz, Sizzly Slide, Glitzy Glow, Batty Bad, Sappy Seed, Freezy Frost, Sparkly Swirl, and Vivi Volley. Each one is a clean elemental expression with an extra effect, taught by move tutors in Kanto in that game's structure. It's a deliberate design answer to a strange question. What if Eevee keeps its branching potential unresolved but gains a move pool that lets it behave like multiple branches anyway? This is one of the few times Pokémon makes Eevee's identity feel almost like a toolbox rather than a destiny. In the main series, Eevee usually asks you to commit. Let's Go asks you to stay uncommitted, then hands you a move list that turns uncommitted into a playstyle. Sword and Shield introduces another canon variant of that trade-off philosophy through Gigantamax. A Gigantamax-capable Eevee cannot evolve, and it gains its own G-Max move, G-Max Cuddle, which can infatuate opponents. So again, the franchise offers a fork, branching evolutions, or a singular Eevee as its self-spectacle identity. All of this sits on top of a quieter, older truth that matters in every generation. Timing shapes vocabulary. Because Eevee evolves in so many different ways, players repeatedly run into the same tactical decision: how long to keep Eevee unevolved, to learn or retain certain moves before specializing. Stone evolutions make this feel especially deliberate. You can hold the stone in your bag and wait until Eevee has learned the tools you want it to carry forward. Then the evolution feels like a planned handoff, not just a transformation. Friendship evolutions add a different tension. Because you can't always predict the exact level the bond threshold will line up with your leveling pace, you end up controlling the final level up more carefully. That can influence move timing in a way the player feels, even if they never articulate it as learn set planning. Location evolutions, in the games that use Moss Rock and Ice Rock, add the sharpest timing pressure of all. You can't casually grind in the wrong area without risking a permanent outcome. So players naturally start manipulating experience gain like they're handling a volatile substance, which makes the eventual evolution feel like a controlled experiment. Move reminder systems in later generations deepen that feeling of vocabulary management. The series increasingly treats moves as something a Pokémon can re-access, not only something it learns once and forgets forever. That changes how Eevee planning feels across eras, because the cost of evolving too early is less absolute in games with generous remembering tools. Even when those systems make planning easier, they don't erase the identity lesson. They just change the stakes from irreversible loss to inconvenient detour. Eevee remains the species that teaches you to think about preparation as part of evolution. And then there's a layer of move pool identity that isn't about special gimmicks at all. It's about how each Eeveelution's best-known moves tend to match its body language. Vaporeon's most natural turns feel like water that doesn't stop. Jolteon's feel like a flicker of voltage that arrives before you can brace. Flareon's feel like stored heat finally released. Espeon's feel like a clean thought made into force. Umbreon's feel like the slow certainty of a door closing and staying closed. Leafeon's feel like a sharp, living blade. Glaceon's feel like cold air tightening around a mistake. Sylveon's feel like softness that becomes control the moment you underestimate it. That's not fan poetry stapled onto mechanics. It's what consistent learn set design produces in the player's memory. If you want the practical researcher takeaway from moves, it's this. The Eevee line is one of the clearest demonstrations that Pokémon uses learn sets to enforce identity, not just to provide options. Eevee begins flexible. Each evolution becomes more legible by narrowing into a repeatable style. And every time the franchise wants to say something new about Eevee, about potential, about bonding systems, about unique partner status, it doesn't only change dialogue. It changes what Eevee can do on a turn. That's the most honest form of canon the games have, because you can reproduce it endlessly. If you strip the Eevee line down to its simplest canon truth, it's this. Eevee is a species whose body reacts so strongly to conditions that future is not fixed. That idea is stated in Pokédex language, expressed in evolution methods, reinforced in stats, and enforced through abilities and moves. And because it's enforced, it becomes something you can feel, rather than something you have to believe. That's why Eeveelutions outlast trends. Not because there are many of them, but because they are one of the franchise's most repeatable ways of letting a player tell a personal story using canon mechanics. Eevee doesn't ask you to admire it. It asks you to decide what it becomes. The line begins with the cleanest kind of choice. 3 stones in Kanto. You are handed Eevee in a quiet building, and then you're handed access to the tools that can rewrite it. That pairing teaches a subtle lesson. Sometimes the world gives you potential, and the rest is on you. Youngto then teaches a different lesson. Some choices can't be purchased. Espeon and Umbreon ask for consistency, for attention paid in small ways, and for respect toward timing. They turn evolution into a reflection of routine. Sinnoh and later regions teach that environment is not decoration. Leafeon and Glaceon make geography and climate feel like forces strong enough to override your intentions. They teach you that some outcomes are not about what you want, but about where you are and what conditions you stepped into. Kalos teaches that interaction is not optional flavor. It can be a prerequisite for identity. Sylveon ties evolution to bond and expression, and it does it while carrying the weight of a brand new type chart. It teaches you that the franchise is willing to reshape itself, and that Eevee is one of the tools it uses to make that reshaping personal. Then the modern era teaches something quieter. Sometimes complexity is folded back into readability. Leafeon and Glaceon become stone evolutions again in later titles. Sylveon's bond requirement is expressed through the more general friendship system rather than a separate affection meter. Those changes don't break the line's logic. They reveal what the franchise values at that moment. Fewer friction points, fewer hidden meters, fewer "you must stand in this exact spot" demands. Eevee keeps adapting because Eevee's story is designed to survive those shifts. If you want a practical, take-it-with-you kind of insight from all of this, it's that Pokémon uses Eevee as a tutorial for reading the series itself. Eevee teaches you that mechanics are not just mechanics. They are the series' way of making a worldview enforceable. The Pokédex says Eevee has unstable genetics. The game proves it by letting a stone rewrite its body instantly. The series then expands that proof by letting time, bond, place, weather logic, and move expression all function as triggers. So if you ever feel like Pokémon lore is just flavor, Eevee is the counterexample that stays canon no matter how you play. You can ignore the lore and still be forced to respect the conditions. That's why Eevee is such a strong bridge between casual play and deep analysis. Both paths arrive at the same truth, just through different doors. The line also teaches a second lesson that's easy to miss if you only think in terms of power. Choice is more meaningful when the options are equally real. Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon share a stat budget, so the choice isn't good versus bad. It's which strength do you want to carry. Espeon and Umbreon are equally real because they represent equally valid outcomes of the same bond under different timing. Leafeon and Glaceon are equally real because they represent equally valid ecological commitments. Sylveon is equally real because it represents equally valid identity built through expression. This is why debates about best Eeveelution never end cleanly. The line isn't built to crown one winner. It's built to let players reveal themselves through what kind of control they value. Speed, endurance, force, precision, refusal, ecology, influence. That's the personal connection piece that makes this line so sticky. Kevin turns preference into permanence. And permanence is what makes a choice feel like a story. When I think back on my own play history, the Eeveelutions I picked map uncomfortably well onto who I was at the time. As a kid, I gravitated toward Jolteon, because going first felt like certainty. Later, I gravitated toward Vaporeon because I wanted fights to feel stable and survivable. When I finally learned to appreciate slow control, Umbreon started feeling like a form of calm strength rather than a boring wall. Those aren't just favorite Pokémon shifts, they're shifts in what I valued, expressed through a canon system that let me make the value visible. That's what Eevee does better than almost any other line. It makes self-interpretation feel like gameplay without ever asking you to introspect. The line also endures because it supports multiple kinds of attention. You can love Eevee for how it looks and still have a complete experience. You can love Eevee for how it functions and still have a complete experience. Or you can love it for how it exposes Pokémon's design logic. And that's where the relentless researcher angle becomes rewarding. If you trace Eevee across games, you can literally watch the franchise negotiating between world building and convenience, between hidden systems and player clarity, between making the map meaningful and making the menu convenient. Eevee is the record of those negotiations, preserved in mechanics that you can reproduce. That's rare. Most long-running series change their rules and ask you to forget old ones. Pokémon does change rules, but it often does it through translation rather than erasure, and Eevee is the clearest translator it has. A moss rock becomes a leaf stone later, but the story is still forest stimulus produces leaf adaptation. Affection becomes friendship again. But the story is still bond plus expression produces fairy adaptation. That translation pattern is why the line doesn't feel like a pile of contradictions. The method changes, but the premise stays stable. Eevee responds to conditions. The conditions are the language of the generation. There's also a broader cultural lesson the Eevee line teaches without trying to be inspirational. It's simply the reality of branching. Potential is powerful, but it creates pressure. A creature with one clear destiny is easy to raise because the path is obvious. A creature with many possible destinies forces you to choose, and choice creates responsibility. That's why so many players save before evolving Eevee even when they've evolved Eevee a dozen times. The ritual persists because the line is built to make decision feel weighty. If you're listening to all this and wondering what use this has beyond trivia, here's the clearest form of it. Eevee is one of the best case studies in how a fictional world can make personality, habit, and environment matter without speeches. It does it through enforceable rules. The result is that when you play Pokémon, you're not only fighting, you're learning to pay attention to timing, to location, to how you treat a partner, to what you practice. Eevee is the species that makes those kinds of attention feel rewarded, rather than abstract. That's why this line connects so easily across audiences. Kids understand it as, I get to pick my favorite. Older players understand it as, I get to build a plan. And people who like lore understand it as, I can see the franchise's philosophy shift through one species. All three understandings are valid and canon compatible because the line is built to support them. So the simplest way to think about Eeveelutions is not as 8 creatures. It's as 8 different answers to the same question. What happens to a body built for change when you expose it to different worlds? Water makes it endure. Electricity makes it strike first. Fire makes it store pressure and release it. Day and bond make it sharpen into mind. Night and bond make it harden into patience. Forest makes it commit to growth. Ice makes it commit to cold. Fairy expression and bond make it convert the ordinary into influence. All of those answers are canon, and all of them are enforced by the game's rules, which is why they feel like more than trivia. If you want one final image to carry out of this, it's not an epic battle. It's a simple party screen with an Eevee sitting there at a level where it could change at any moment. That moment, the moment before the choice is finalized, is the real core of the line. Because the Eevee family is not only about what you become, it's about how many different futures can be true at once, right up until the second you decide which condition matters most. There's a reason Eevee decisions feel heavier than most evolution decisions, even when you already know the outcome. Most Pokémon lines are written like roads with a few turns. Eevee is written like a crossroads where the map itself is watching which direction you take. That weight comes from a rare combination: scarcity, permanence, and clarity. Scarcity makes the choice feel like it matters, because you might not get another Eevee soon. Permanence makes it matter because you can't test drive the identity in the same way you can test moves. Clarity is the final ingredient. Each Eeveelution is instantly legible as a life choice, not just a stat change. You can tell what kind of Pokémon it is from its silhouette, its type, and the way it behaves the moment it enters battle. That legibility is not accidental. The Eevee family is built around what game designers sometimes call readability, and Pokémon executes it as if readability is a moral principle. If a new player picks Jolteon, the game makes sure Jolteon feels fast, looks fast, and plays fast. The same is true for Umbreon. It looks like a creature built to endure, and then its battles turn into endurance stories. That alignment turns what could have been a shallow menu choice into a long-running memory. One of the most useful research lenses for Eevee is to treat the family like a set of teaching models. Vaporeon teaches that survival can be a strategy, not a failure to be aggressive. Jolteon teaches that speed is not only convenience, it's control over the order of events. Flareon teaches a different kind of control, the power to end a conversation quickly when the system supports it. Espeon teaches that prevention can be stronger than recovery, because it can stop the opponent from setting the terms. Umbreon teaches that winning can look like refusing to collapse, even when the opponent is technically stronger. Leafeon and Glaceon teach that the map can carry rules deeper than trainer battles. They make you treat geography like a variable you can plan around. Sylveon teaches that expression matters, that what you practice and how you bond can be treated as biology. That makes Eevee one of the franchise's clearest arguments about identity. Identity in Pokémon is not only what you are, it's what conditions shaped you. The Eevee line repeats that argument across generations with different methods, and the methods are the real text. Stone evolutions are a statement about agency. You have the tool, you decide the moment, you lock it in. That's evolution framed like technology. Intervention produces specialization. Friendship and time evolutions are a statement about consistency. No single day creates Espeon or Umbreon. A pattern does. That's evolution framed like cultivation. Routine produces identity. Location evolutions are a statement about environment. The world is not neutral, and some places carry forces that override personal plans. That's evolution framed like ecology. Habitat produces specialization. Move plus bond evolutions are a statement about expression. A learned move is not only a technique, it's proof the organism has developed along a particular pathway. That's evolution framed like practice. Repetition produces form. When you look at Eevee this way, the line starts behaving like a miniature history of Pokemon's design philosophy. Each generation has a different answer to the question of how much friction players should endure to obtain a specific identity. Eevee is one of the few lines that can reflect those answers without breaking its own premise. The rock-to-stone shift for Leafeon and Glaceon is the clearest example. The creatures stay the same. The stimulus idea stays the same. But the delivery method changes to match the era's priorities. That reveals something important. Pokémon cares about world logic, but it cares just as much about flow. Flow is the part many people notice without naming. If a game's structure expects you to roam widely, anchoring a form to a single coordinate can become friction that no longer feels like discovery. So the franchise translates environmental stimulus into portable stimulus and keeps the identity intact. That translation is why Eevee feels consistent even as the series changes its interface language. Friendship and affection get separated, then recombined. Locations become items, then remain items. Underneath those changes, the thesis stays stable. Eevee is responsive. A responsive organism is, by definition, compatible with multiple triggers. The canon premise is broad enough that the mechanics can shift without snapping the story. It's also worth noticing how Eevee absorbs the franchise's big structural changes without losing its recognizability. The physical/special split changes how some evolutions express their stats, but the core roles remain legible. Abilities arrive and immediately reinforce the Become the Element theme for the original trio, almost like the series retroactively underlined the original intent. New types enter the chart, and Eevee becomes one of the safest places to introduce them as something the player will actually use. Fairy type is not only introduced, it is delivered through a line players already trust. That trust is a kind of narrative infrastructure, and Pokémon uses it deliberately. This is where Eevee's cultural role inside the franchise matters as much as its mechanical role. Eevee is often framed across media as approachable, a first favorite kind of Pokémon. That approachability makes it an ideal carrier for complicated ideas because the player's attention is already there. A new mechanic attached to a forgettable species becomes trivia. A new mechanic attached to Eevee becomes a story many people will personally experience. That's not marketing talk. It's simply how attention works in long-running franchises. I've seen this in my own play, and it's slightly embarrassing how consistent it is. When a game introduces a new evolution method, I'm more likely to test my understanding on Eevee than on almost any other line. It's not because Eevee is the most powerful, it's because Eevee is the clearest measuring instrument. Eevee makes you notice whether you understand the rules. Did the time of day register the way you thought it did? Did the location priority override the bond gate, the way the system says it will? Did the move requirement matter at the exact level up moment, not 5 minutes earlier? Eevee is where vague knowledge becomes verified knowledge. That is a rare role for a single species to play across an entire series. There's also a deeper psychological lesson hidden in how people talk about their Eeveelutions. Players often describe their choice as if it reflects who they are, even though the game never asks them to roleplay. That happens because branching turns preference into consequence. A fixed evolution line can still be loved, but it doesn't interrogate you. A branching line asks, quietly, what you value. Do you value speed, safety, precision, endurance, or control through subtle pressure? The answer shows up in your party screen and it stays there. That permanence creates ownership. Ownership creates attachment. Attachment is why people keep returning to the Eevee line even when they've caught hundreds of other species. The Eevee family is not only collectible, it's autobiographical. Each evolution is a small statement you made, and the game remembers it. That autobiographical quality becomes stronger when the evolution method itself implies a story. Umbreon implies nights and routine, because it literally requires the night clock state. Leafeon and Glaceon, in their rock era, imply pilgrimage, because you had to go to a specific place. Sylveon implies deliberate care and expression, because you had to nurture a bond and teach a fairy move. Even the simplest stone evolutions imply decisive intervention. You owned the tool, then you used it. The mechanics don't narrate those stories in text, but the player experiences them as lived sequences. Eevee also teaches something useful about how Pokémon balances freedom and structure. The line offers freedom in outcomes, but structure in requirements. You can choose, but you must choose within rules. Those rules are what make the choice meaningful. If Eevee could become anything at any time with no conditions, it would be novelty, not identity. Conditions create the sense that the world has physics, and physics creates stakes. Stakes are why people still save before evolving Eevee, even when they've done it dozens of times. It's not ignorance, it's ritual. Ritual is what happens when a mechanical action carries emotional consequences. That ritual is also reinforced by how the franchise distributes Eevee. Eevee is often given as a gift, or placed in a way that makes it feel earned. That distribution style says, without dialogue, this Pokémon is special enough that you should pay attention to it. The games also sometimes do the opposite. They flood areas with Eevee, especially in eras and regions where catching multiple is easy. Even then, the choice still matters, because multiple Eevee doesn't remove permanence, it multiplies it. You don't get less identity, you get a family of identities you curated. That creates a different kind of pleasure. One Eevee evolution is a personal statement. A full set of Eeveelutions is a collection that looks like a taxonomy you built yourself. This is where the line becomes a bridge between collectors and planners. Collectors enjoy the completeness of the set. Planners enjoy that each branch is a different role with different conditions. Both are canon ways to play, and Eevee accommodates both without needing separate systems. That flexibility is why Eevee remains relevant even as Pokémon's audience changes. It can serve nostalgia, optimization, aesthetic preference, and curiosity at the same time. There's also a subtle world-building value in Eevee that goes beyond the family itself. Eevee provides a coherent in-universe explanation for why evolution can be rapid and conditional. If Eevee is genetically unstable and responsive, then stones, time, place, and bond can all be treated as triggers without making the world feel purely magical. That doesn't answer every weird evolution in the franchise, but it provides a template. If you can believe Eevee reacts to stimuli, then you can believe other species might have their own specific triggers. Eevee makes the idea of evolution rules feel like part of biology, rather than a set of arbitrary unlock conditions. This is one of the reasons Eevee is so often used in educational moments across the franchise's media. It's a safe example. It's flexible enough to demonstrate principles, and familiar enough that the audience doesn't resist the lesson. Even without overt teaching, the games train you through Eevee to respect systems you can't see. Friendship is mostly invisible, but the evolution proves it exists. Time of day is easy to ignore, but the evolution punishes that ignorance. Location energy is never explained in scientific detail, but the rock evolution enforces it as a reality. Move knowledge as an evolution requirement turns the moveset into a biological signal. By the time you've raised a few Eevee, you've learned to treat hidden variables as real. That skill transfers across Pokémon. It makes you more attentive to conditions, more willing to plan, and more aware that the world has rules beyond what is explicitly displayed. Eevee is one of the cleanest places the franchise teaches that mental posture. There's also a strange but important point about restraint. The Eevee line has not been expanded in every generation, even though it could be. That restraint preserves the line's identity. If Eevee gained a new evolution constantly, the family would become noise. By spacing evolutions out, the franchise keeps each edition feeling like a statement rather than clutter. Each new Eeveelution has to justify itself as a new idea, not just a new color. Sylveon is a perfect example of that justification. It didn't arrive as another element. It arrived as new type, new balance logic, new bonding emphasis, all at once. That's why Sylveon still feels important even years after its debut. Its existence is a historical marker inside the series, a point where Pokémon changed its own foundational chart and used Eevee to make that change feel personal. Eevee did what it always does. It turned a system update into a creature you could care about. If you're looking for the Mehrwert that holds up beyond trivia, it's the way Eevee makes an argument about change that isn't sentimental and isn't vague. Change in Pokémon is conditional, not random. Outcomes are shaped by environment, routine, expression, and decisive intervention. That's a clean model for thinking about systems in general. It trains you to ask, what are the conditions here before you demand a specific outcome? It also trains you to accept that different conditions can produce equally valid results. That last part is easy to overlook, but it's central. The Eevee line is not built around a single correct endpoint. It is built around a family of endpoints that are all canon complete. So the real lesson isn't choose the best form. The lesson is, choose the form that matches your intention and your context. Pokémon rarely states that philosophy directly, but Eevee enforces it. I keep coming back to a small, concrete moment that captures the whole line. An Eevee is one battle away from leveling up, and you stop walking forward because you suddenly remember where you are. Forest, mountain, day, night, move prepared, bond prepared. That hesitation is Eevee's true power. It makes you pause, it makes you account for the world, and it makes the outcome feel earned because you respected the rules. In a series full of dramatic transformations, Eevee's most dramatic moment is often a quiet decision in a mundane place. That quiet decision is why the line endures. It's a mirror that reflects how you play, what you value, and what kind of stories you like to create inside a rule-bound world. And because the rules are canon and repeatable, the story never feels like something you invented outside the game. It feels like something the Pokémon world allowed because you understood it. Eevee is the species where understanding becomes identity. That is a rare kind of reward, and it's the reason Eeveelution facts never runs out of depth even when the list of forms stays the same.